Prathama Samadhi, the chapter I Meditative Absorption. The chapter begins by introducing the subject of the work and providing a definition of yoga, the cessation of citta, vritti, the fluctuating states of the mind 1 to 2. This is followed by a discussion of the two possible functions of awareness 3 to 4, a description of the vittas 5 to 11, and how to control them by practice 13 to 14 and dispassion 15 to 16. Then comes the division of samadhi into samprajanata 17 and asamprajanata 18 samadhis, and how to attain it 20 to 22, after pointing to other states that might resemble it 19. Isvara is then introduced as the easy method of attaining samadhi 23, along with his nature 24 to 26, name 27, worship 28, and the fruits accruing therefrom 29. The chapter describes the distractions of the mind 30 and their accompanying effects such as grief, etc. 31. Outlines the means to combat these by dwelling on one truth 32, practicing benevolence, etc. 33, breath control 34, and other means 35 to 39 that are conducive to samadhi. Additionally, the variety of samapatti meditative states 42 with definitions 42 to 44 and their fruits 46 to 48 and object 49 are presented. The chapter concludes with a discussion of samprajanata, samadhi preceding the final stage of asamprajanata 50 to 51. O Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, I offer obeisances to Lord Vasudeva. 1. Commentators and authors of traditional texts typically begin their commentaries with an invocation, Nandi, Sloka, to their personal deity, the particular form of Isvara, God, that they revere, soliciting blessings and inspiration for the enterprise they are about to undertake. This, notes Vijanabhikkhu, is in order to remove any obstacles that might arise either in the completion of the work by the author, or in the student's ability to grasp its meaning. By so doing, one also strives to remove personal ego so that one can become a conduit, accurately transmitting the essence of the text. Most commentators on the Yoga Sutras, in addition to an invocation to God, offer homage to Patanjali himself, the author of the text, usually invoking him in his traditional form as an incarnation of Ea, the bearer of Vayu. 2. 1 Atha Yoganusasanam Atha, now, Yoga, Anasasanam, teachings now, the teachings of yoga are presented. It is common for authors of philosophical works to commence their treatises by announcing the specific nature of their subject matter, thereby indicating how their undertakings are to be distinguished from other strains of philosophical thought or knowledge systems. Thus, while from the 6 classical schools of Hindu philosophy 3 the followers of the Vedanta school see their tradition as explaining the nature of the absolute truth, Brahman, and the followers of the Vaiyika and MMA with Macron schools as explaining the nature of Dharma, duty, and these respective points of focus are announced in the first sutras of the primary texts associated with those schools, for the Yoga school is interested in the subject of yoga. 5 Patanjali accordingly uses the first sutra of his text to announce the topic of his teachings. The primary subject matter of his text differs from that of other systems insofar as his work will be about yoga. It is also standard in the commentarial literature, as will become apparent throughout this work, for the later commentators to analyze each word in every sutra, as discussed in the introduction. Sutra means aphorism or extremely succinct verse, and words are analyzed in various ways etymologically, semantically, contextually, philosophically, etc. Commentaries thus unpack the meaning of words, both individually and collectively, in the sutras of primary texts. Vyasa, Vaikaspati Misra, Vijanabhikkhu, Sakara, Bhojaraja, Ramnanda Sarasvati, and Hariharananda Araya are, in chronological order, the main commentators recognized as the most important of the pre-modern period, and their interpretations form the basis of the present commentary. Accordingly, the first word in the sutra, and thus of the entire Yoga Sutras, is Atha, now, that is, in the present work Patanjali is about to deliver, demarking these teachings from those in other texts. The word also initiates the opening sutras of other philosophical works 6. As will be seen below with Vijanabhiku's comments, the word atha is also sometimes read as differentiating the text in question from other texts in a hierarchical or sectarian fashion, as indicating that when one has exhausted dabbling with other philosophical or religious systems as represented in other texts, one has now finally come to the summum bonum of truth, namely, that represented by the text in question. 7. The commentators add, as an aside, that the word atha is deemed somewhat sacred and thus also functions as an auspicious opening to the text. Vyasa, the primary and most important commentator, whose commentary is almost as canonical as Patanjali's primary text, then proceeds to discuss yoga, the second word in the sutra. In accordance with the famous Sanskrit grammarian Pini, he glosses yoga with samadhi, the ultimate subject matter of the Yoga Sutras. Samadhi consists of various contemplative stages of mental concentration that will be described in detail throughout the text. Indeed, the commentator Vaikaspati Misra traces the etymology of yoga to one of the meanings of the root yaje, to contemplate, which, he points out, is the correct etymology here. The more established etymology from the perspective of modern historical linguistics is, of course, derived from the same Indo-European root as the English word yoke. 9. Yoga can thus mean that which joins, that is, unites one with the absolute truth, and while this translation of the term is popularly found, and may be apt in other contexts, such as the Gita, 3410, it is best avoided in the context of the Yoga Sutras, since, as was pointed out over 100 years ago by the famous Indologist Max Muller, 1899, 309 ff, and long before that, by the 16th century Indian doxographer Madhav 11, the goal of yoga is not to join, but the opposite, to unjoin, that is, to disconnect purua from prakti. 12. If the term is to mean yoke, it entails yoking the mind on an object of concentration without deviation. Elaborating on this, Vyasa notes that when the mind is directed toward an object, it can manifest 5 different degrees of focus: bhumis, wondering, confused, distracted, concentrated, and restrained. It is the last 2 that are of interest to yoga. When the mind, citta, is restrained and concentrated, or fixed on one point, a type of samadhi known as samprajanata can be attained. 13. Samprajanata, samadhi entails concentrating the mind in various degrees upon an object of concentration. 14, all of which will be discussed at length below. Vyasa also introduces the notion of asamprajanata, samadhi in these opening comments. This is the 7th and ultimate level of samadhi, when all activities of the mind have been fully restrained, including those involved in samprajanata, samadhi of one-pointed concentration on an object. Since asamprajanata, samadhi will also be discussed at length in the text, we will simply note here that in this state, pure objectless consciousness alone remains, that is, self-contained consciousness, conscious only of its own internal nature of pure consciousness rather than of any external object. Vyasa thus provides a mini preview of the subject matter of the Yoga Sutras in his opening comments. Vyasa makes a point of noting that a distracted mind, the third on his list of states, is not to be confounded with yoga. Vaikaspati Misra elaborates that while it is obvious that the other 2 states of mind, wondering and forgetfulness, 15, are not yoga, a distracted state of mind may appear to be so because it is periodically fixed. However, since such steadiness soon relapses into wondering and forgetfulness, it cannot be considered real yoga. Only the fully concentrated or one-pointed state of mind is yoga. Vaikaspati Misra notes that the third and final term from this sutra, anu, sasanam, strictly speaking means further teaching. 16. He points out that the Ajanavakaya states that a sage known as Hiryagarbha was the original teacher of yoga. Hence Patanjali is using the prefix anu, which indicates the continuation of the activity denoted by the noun to which it is prefixed, in this case, sasanam, teachings. The Mahabharata also identifies Hiryagarbha as the founder of yoga. 12. 326.65, 337.60. In the Puric tradition, E.G. Bhagavatapura, X. 71.8, Hirayagarbha is considered to be an epithet of Brahma, the celestial being responsible for engineering the forms in the universe. In Puric lore, for example, Bhagavatapura, which is quoted frequently herein, 3.8, Hirayagarbha is born on a lotus emanating from the navel of Vayu, the supreme Godhead, who is reclining on the divine serpent. Yea, on the cosmic waters pervading the entire universe prior to creation. As an aside, Patanjali himself is considered an incarnation of Ea, see commentary in 2.47. Awakening to consciousness atop the lotus, Hirayagarbha has no means of knowing who he is, or what is the source of the lotus or the all-expansive waters, indeed, no means of discerning or knowing anything at all. Confused and disoriented, he stills his mind, in accordance with the next verse, and enters into the ultimate state of yoga, samadhi, as a result of which he is granted a divine vision of Lord Vayu. Hirayagarbha is thus the first yogi in primordial times, and deemed to have written the original treatise on the subject. Although mentioned in various texts, the Hirayagarbha treatise is no longer extant, but information about its 12-fold content, all overlapping with the material found in Patanjali's Sutras, 17 is preserved in the Vayava text, the Ahirbhutna Sahit. 18. Indeed, the information provided in this text suggests that Patanjali has, indeed, preserved the ancient formulation of the original philosophy ascribed to Hirayagarbha, rather than patching together some innovative yogic collage. 19. Elsewhere, Vyasa also refers to the teachings of one Jayagavya as a forerunner of yoga. 2.55. Madhav in his 16th century doxography, Compendium of Philosophical Schools, states that Patanjali, out of kindness, seeing how difficult it was to make sense of all the different types of yoga scattered throughout the Puras, 20 collected their essences, 111. Patanjali is not the founder of the practice of yoga, which, Vaikaspati Misra stresses, is an ancient practice that preceded even Patanjali. Thus, by using the prefix Anu, Patanjali himself implies that he has articulated and systematized a method from pre-existing sets of teachings. His opening sutra, Atha Yoganosasanam, thus informs the reader about the subject matter of the text. Although yoga becomes one of 6 schools of orthodox Hindu thought, its adherents naturally consider it to supersede the other schools. Vijanabhiku, the most philosophical of the commentators, quotes a number of scriptural passages that point to the supremacy of yoga. For example, Ka, in the Bhagavad Gita, which Vijanabhiku quotes frequently, states, "The yogi is higher than the ascetic, and also considered higher than the Jnani, one who pursues knowledge. The yogi is higher still than the karmi, one who performs action, therefore, Arjuna, become a yogi." 6.46. Just as all rivers such as the Gag are present as parts of the ocean, says Vijanabhiku, so all other schools of thought are fully represented as parts of yoga. While he allows that one can certainly obtain genuine knowledge from these other schools, all knowledge is, by its very nature, a faculty of the intellect, buddhi, it is not a faculty of the soul proper. Sectarianism apart, it is perhaps useful to consider the argument so as to establish a preliminary understanding of the mind and intellect from yoga perspectives. All aspects of mind, intellect, and cognition in yoga psychology are external to or distinct from the true self, or soul. As will become clearer, the soul, which is pure consciousness, is autonomous and separable from the mind, and lies behind and beyond all forms of thought. It is essential to fully grasp this fundamental point in order to understand the yoga system. Just as in most religious systems the body is commonly accepted to be extraneous to and separable from some notion of a soul or life force, and discarded at death, so, in contrast to certain major strains of Western thought, according to the yoga system, and Hindu thought in general, The mind is also held to be extraneous to and separable from the soul, although it is discarded not at death but only upon attaining liberation. The soul is enveloped in two external and separable bodies in Yoga Metaphysics. 21. The gross material body consisting of the senses, and the subtle body consisting of the mind, intellect, ego, and other subtle aspects of the persona. 22. At death, the soul discards the gross body, which returns to the material elements, to dust, but remains encapsulated in the subtle body, which is retained from life to life, and eventually attains a new gross body, in accordance with natural laws, karma, etc. In order to be liberated from this cycle of repeated birth and death, termed sasra in ancient Indian thought, the soul has to be uncoupled from not just the gross body but the subtle body of the siddha as well. The process of yoga is directed toward this end. For our present purposes, then, in contrast to the Cartesian model, knowledge, as a feature of the intellect, or the discriminatory aspect of the mind, is extraneous to the pure self and thus not the ultimate aspect of being. The point here is that while knowledge is initially essential in leading the yogi practitioner through the various levels of samadhi, concentrative states, it is only through yoga, for Vijnabhikkhu, that one can transcend the very intellect itself and thus the base of knowledge, to arrive at Purua, the ultimate state of pure, unconditioned awareness. From this perspective, yoga is therefore superior to other schools of thought that occupy themselves with knowledge and thus remain connected to the material intellect. Just as a person with a torch in hand gives up the torch upon finding treasure, says Vijnabhikkhu, so, eventually, the intellect, and the knowledge that it presents, also become redundant upon attaining the ultimate source of truth, Purua, the soul, and innermost self. The self is pure subjectivity 23 and transcends all knowledge, which is of the nature of objectivity. One knows, that is, one is aware or conscious of something, hence some other object distinct from the knower or power of consciousness itself, whether this is an external object of the physical world, or an internal object of thought. Thus, Vijnabhikkhu says, paraphrasing Skyakarika XXXV, knowledge and the intellect are the door and doorkeeper, and both lead the practitioner of yoga from the domain of material cognition to the highest goal of existence, realization of Purua, consciousness itself, but this ultimately lies beyond even the intellect. This state of pure consciousness, which is not conscious of anything other than consciousness itself, is termed asamprajanata, samadhi. The attainment of this state is the ultimate goal for the school of yoga, not any type of knowledge however profound or mystical. Hence, from this perspective, yoga is superior to knowledge-centered paths. The origins of yoga are rooted in direct perception of its subject matter, says the commentator Hariharananda Raya. He too notes that yoga is based not on the mere logical reasoning of the intellect but on direct experience, and in this regard differs from some of the other schools of orthodox thought, which are highly philosophical. Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is more a psychosomatic technique than a treatise on metaphysics. The truths of yoga cannot be experienced by inferential reasoning but only by direct perception, as will be seen in I. 49. The yoga school prioritizes experience over other forms of attaining knowledge. These personal realizations, says Hariharananda, are handed down from teacher to disciple, generation after generation. The teachings of yoga are an attempt to encapsulate those truths as best as possible through the medium of words and concepts. Since the ultimate truth of the soul, attained in asamprajanata, samadhi, is by definition beyond the intellect, and thus beyond words and concepts, the primary purpose of this text is, as far as possible, to point the reader toward the actual practice of yoga. While the Yoga Sutras provides much interesting information on the nature of Hindu psychology and soteriology, it is useful to keep in mind that its intended function is as a manual for the practitioner, hence its cryptic nature from the perspective of the intellect. I. 2 Yoga Siddha, Vitti, Nara Yoga, Yoga, Siddha, the mind, Vitti, fluctuation, state, Nara, restraint, control yoga is the stilling of the changing states of the mind. There are various definitions of yoga expressed in different traditions which, while all overlapping, reflect the fact that yoga referred to a cluster of practices featuring various forms of discipline and mind control practiced by many differing ascetics and communities on the landscape of ancient India with a view to liberation from the sufferings of embodied life. It was not associated with a distinct school until well into the Common Era. 24 In the Kaha Upanishad, for example, yoga is believed to be when the senses are firmly under control. 6. 11. While in the Karma Yoga, Path of Action, section of the Bhagavad Gita, yoga is defined as samatvam, evenness of mind. 2. 48. And as karmesa kausalam, skill in action. 2. 50. Elsewhere, the text defines yoga as dukkha, sayaga, vyagam, separation from union with pain. 6. 23, which is essentially the definition given in the Vedic Sutras, dukkha, the absence of pain. V. 2.1625, a definition that finds its roots in the Kaha Upanishad. 2. 12. 26 The Nyaya Sutras associate the practice of yoga with the attainment of liberation. 4. 2.46. While his teachings will incorporate all the above definitions, Patanjali here gives his formal definition of yoga for the classical school of yoga itself. Yoga is the stilling of all thought. The commentators have packed a considerable amount of rather dense information into their commentaries in the sutra, since Patanjali has basically defined and summarized the entire system of yoga here, and the commentaries use the sutra to lay out the infrastructure of the psychology and metaphysics of the yoga process. Although an attempt will be made here to present the information in stages, the unfamiliar reader might well feel alarmed or overwhelmed by the sudden immersion in yogic concepts and Sanskrit terms presented in the commentary to the sutra. The task is complicated somewhat since the commentators presuppose that their readers are aware of the system of Skya, one of the other 6 schools of orthodox Indian thought with which the yoga school is typically coupled. 27 Having said this, there are advantages to the sudden immersion technique into yoga psychology. Psychology that follows, since once the basics are grasped, the teachings of yoga become progressively clearer as one advances through the text. The reader unfamiliar with Hindu metaphysics is reassured that if a clear and coherent picture of yoga psychology is not gained at this early stage, the material presented in the commentary for the sutra will be unpacked, explained, reiterated, and elaborated upon repeatedly and in great detail throughout the remainder of the text such that one soon becomes familiar with the system. Additionally, there are a dozen or more technical Sanskrit words that are retained throughout this translation, which do not translate succinctly into English, and a number of them will be introduced here in rapid succession, but, again, readers will become familiar with them by dint of sheer repetition. That said, the commentary for the sutra remains unavoidably challenging since it presents something of a synopsis of yoga psychology and practice, and an understanding of these requires a prior discussion of Skya and yoga metaphysics. The first of the Yoga Sutras introduced the subject matter of the text, a discussion of yoga, and this second sutra proceeds to define what this yoga is. According to Patanjali's definition in the sutra, yoga is the cessation, niraya, of the permutations or activities, vitas, of the siddha. In order to define siddha, perhaps the most important entity in yoga practice, one must become familiar with ultimate reality as elaborated upon in the Skya, literally, numeration, system. As we know, in Skya, ultimate reality is perceived as the product of 2 distinct ontological categories, prakti, or the primordial material matrix of the physical universe, and purua, pure awareness, the innermost conscious self or soul. The terms consciousness and awareness, although problematic, 28 will be used interchangeably in this commentary to refer to the nature of the purua. As a result of the contact between these 2 distinct entities, prakti and purua, the material universe evolves in a sequential fashion. To reiterate, the first and subtlest evolutes from the material matrix, according to Skya, are, in order, buddhi, intelligence, ahakara, ego, and manas, mind. These layers, which are grouped together under the rubric of the internal body, 29 constitute the inner life of an individual, and the Purua soul is cloaked in these psychic layers prior to receiving a gross physical body equipped with senses. The term citta, from cit, to think, consider, fix the mind on, is used in this sutra and throughout the text by Patanjali and the commentators to refer to all three of these cognitive functions combined. The yoga school differs somewhat from that of Skya in conceiving these three as interacting functions of the one citta, mind, rather than as three distinct metaphysical layers 30, but the main point, as stressed in the last sutra, is that they are distinct from the soul proper. Buddhi, intelligence, is the aspect of citta that produces, among other things, the functions of thought connected to judgment, discrimination, knowledge, ascertainment, and will. 31. From bud, to wake up, be aware of. It is the most important aspect of the citta as it is from its function of discrimination that liberation is achieved. Additionally, it is buddhi that molds itself into the forms of the data funneled to it by manas, below, and presents these images to the Purua soul, to which it is immediately adjacent. Buddhi is thus the liaison between Purua as pure awareness, and the objects, whether physical or psychic, of which Purua can be aware. Ahakara, or ego, 32 produces the function of thought related to self, awareness, self, identity, and self, conceit. The personal pronoun aham means I, and kara, the doer. This is the aspect of citta that causes notions of I-ness and my-ness. I know, I am a man, I am happy, this is mine. It also delimits awareness, which is potentially omnipresent, 33, and refracts it to fit into the contours of the particular body and mind within which it finds itself. It is because of ego that the awareness of an ant is limited to the range of the ant's senses and the conceptual structure of its mind, while the awareness of an elephant has a larger range, and that of a human an even larger range. This restructuring of the lens of ahakara, so to speak, is the result of specific sets of saskras, imprints from present and past lives, which will be discussed in I. 5. Relevant to any particular form bug, dog, or human activating at the appropriate time. Manas, the mind, is the aspect of citta that engages in the functions of thought especially related to organizing sensory input and directing the senses. It imposes a conceptual structure on the chaotic field of raw sensations, recognizing and identifying sensual impetuses and categorizing them, from man, to think, believe. 34. It exhibits attraction to some sensory possibilities, and aversion to others, in other words, the functions of feeling, emotion, and desiring. It is the bridge connecting the world of the sense objects as accessed through the sense organs, the ego, which appropriates this under the notion of I, and the intelligence, which judges, evaluates, and strategizes over the input to determine what its duty, Dharma. 35, is in relation to the data it is receiving from the mind and senses, that is, what to do about it, how to respond or act. In his commentary to the Skya 36, Vaikaspati Misra says, as the village chief collects rent from the heads of the families and presents it to the district chief, who delivers it to the chief superintendent, who delivers it to the king, so the sense organs, having perceived an external object, deliver it to the mind, who considers it and delivers it to the ego, who appropriates it and delivers it to the intelligence, the chief superintendent. Superintendent of all. Thus it is said they present it to intelligence, thereby illuminating the purpose of the Purua. 36. I will gloss the Sanskrit word citta throughout this discussion with the term mind for ease of reference, since this is how it is usually translated, but it should be noted that the term encapsulates all of the functions of thought outlined above. 37. And not just that of manas, which is also usually translated as mind. When I use mind in the latter sense, I will qualify it by the Sanskrit term manas. Vijanabhika states that the citta is the one unified internal organ, and this becomes manifest in the various functions of intelligence, ego, and mind because of vittas. The vittas indicated by Patanjali in this sutra will be categorized into 5 basic types in I-5 and discussed thereafter, and so we will simply note at this point that they ultimately refer to any permutation or activity of the mind, in other words, any sequence of thought, ideas, mental imaging, or cognitive act performed by either the mind, intellect, or ego as defined above, or any state of the mind at all including deep sleep. The verbal root vt means to revolve, turn, proceed, move, and underscores the always active, sequential, rambling aspect of the mind. The mind is a physical substance in Hindu thought in general and assumes the forms of the sense data presented to it. The ensuing sense impressions, thoughts, or states are products made of that mental substance, just as a gold statue is a form made from the substance gold, or a clay pot is a form from the substance clay. These constantly moving mental images, states, or formations in the citta are vittas. If citta is the sea, the vittas are its waves, the specific forms it takes. They will be defined in I-5 below. I will gloss the term viti with states or activities of mind or fluctuations of thought, and I will refer to pura as pure consciousness or pure awareness. The essential point Patanjali is making here is that since all forms or activities of the mind are products of prakriti, matter, and completely distinct from the soul or true self, purua, they must all be restrained in order for the soul to be realized by the yogi as an autonomous entity distinct from the mind. Since, as Vyasa notes, the soul in its pure state is considered to be free of content and changeless, it does not transform and undergo permutations in the way the mind constantly does. Vijnabhika raises the issue of how it can be aware of objects at all in the first place. Awareness of objects is brought about by means of buddhi, the intellect. The intelligence is the first interface between the soul and the external world. The sense objects provide images that are received through the senses, sorted by the manas, the thinking and organizing aspect of citta, and presented to the intellect. Although inanimate, the intellect molds itself into the form and shape of these objects of experience, thoughts, and ideas. Vijnabhiku compares this process to liquid copper being poured into a mold and taking the exact shape of the mold, although the forms into which buddhi is molded are extremely subtle and psychic in nature. This molding of the citta into these thoughts and ideas is the vittas referred to by Patanjali in this sutra. This process can be compared to dull, opaque external objects being captured as photographic images on film, which is both translucent and representational, or to geometric patterns on a stained glass window, Schweitzer 1993, 853, which are again both translucent and representational. That is to say, images on film or in stained glass are translucent enough to allow the light to filter through them, which, on account of the opaqueness of matter, is not the case with the original external gross objects they represent, due to the greater tamasic component. 38 But they are also representational, insofar as these external objects are still indirectly represented as images on the film or forms in the stained glass windows, becoming visible when pervaded by light. Due to adjacency, the pure consciousness of the soul shines onto the intellect and animates it with consciousness, like a lamp illuminates the film or stained glass with light and makes it appear luminous. Because the pure highly translucent sattva element is maximized in buddhi, it is able to absorb and reflect the soul's power of consciousness. Enveloped in the soul's consciousness, the workings of the citta mind appear to be themselves conscious, but they are in reality unconscious, just as the film or stained glass appears illuminated in their own right but are in actuality dependent on light external to themselves for their illumination and visibility. The awareness of the pure soul permeates the citta, animating the churnings of thought, citta, vittas, but due to ignorance, this animated citta considers consciousness to be inherent within itself, rather than an entity outside and separate from itself. It is this ignorance that is the ultimate cause of bondage and sasra. According to some commentators, most notably, Vijnabhiku, 39. Just as light bounces off an object back to its source, the consciousness of the soul is reflected off this animated intellect and back to the soul. From this perspective, the intellect also functions like a mirror, the soul becoming conscious of its reflection in the animated intellect, just as one becomes conscious of one's appearance in a mirror. However, since the intellect is constantly being transformed into the images presented to it by the mind and senses, this reflection presented back to the Purua soul is constantly obscured and distorted by vittas, just as one's reflection in a mirror is distorted if the mirror is dirty or warped. When this distorted reflection is considered to be inherent within the actual Purua, rather than the product of the Siddha, an entity outside of and separate from it, the soul becomes misidentified with the world of change. Through the changing states of mind, the vittas noted in the sutra, just as one may look at one's reflection in a dirty mirror and mistakenly think that it is oneself who is dirty. Consider a young child looking at herself in one of those crazy mirrors that make one appear grotesquely fat or thin, or, in the pre-modern analogy used by Akara, a face reflected in a long sword, making the face appear elongated. 35. If the child does not realize that her deformed appearance in the mirror is merely a distorted reflection and not her actual self, she may experience fear or panic. The soul, in short, is neither the physical body in which it is encased nor the mind that exhibits psychic functions. It is pure autonomous consciousness. The Sutras refer to a quaint traditional story to illustrate this point. A certain king's son, due to being born under an afflicted astrological constellation, is expelled from the city and raised by a member of the forest-dwelling Sabara tribe. He thus thinks, "I am a Sabara." Upon finding him to be still alive, one of the king's ministers informs him, "You are not a Sabara, you are a king's son." Thereupon, the son gives up the idea that he is a Sabara, accepts his true royal identity, and thinks, "I am a king's son." In the same way, the soul, by means of the instruction of a kind soul the Guru, is informed, "You are manifest from the first soul Brahman, who is made of pure consciousness." Thereupon, giving up the idea of being made of Prakti, the soul thinks, "Because I am the son of Brahman, 40 I am Brahman, not a product of Sasra." 1. Thus, the soul appears to undergo the experiences of the body and mind: birth, death, disease, old age, happiness, distress, peacefulness, anxiety, etc. But these are mere transformations of the body and mind. In other words, they are the permutations of gross and subtle matter external to the soul that are pervaded by the soul's awareness. The mind misidentifies the pure self with these permutations and considers the pure self to be subject to birth and death, happiness and distress, etc. This misidentification, or ignorance, is therefore the root of bondage to the world, as will be discussed in the beginning of chapter 2. As stated in the sutra by Patanjali, yoga involves preventing the mind from being molded into these permutations, the vittas, the impressions and thoughts of the objects of the world. An understanding of the process underpinning the workings of the mind, the siddha, vittas noted here, requires the introduction of a further set of categories, the three gunas, strands or qualities. They are sattva, lucidity, rajas, action, and tamas, inertia. 41 Vyasa and the commentators waste no time discussing these gunas here and continue to do so continuously in their commentaries throughout the text. Since they are pivotal to an understanding of yoga meditation and practice, they require some attention. The gunas are inherent in prakti, matter, and are the catalysts in the evolution of the mind and all manifest reality from primordial prakti. Just as threads are inherent in the production of a rope, says Vijanabhikkhu, so the gunas underpin and permeate the material matrix of prakti. Prakti is constituted by the three gunas. Therefore, since everything evolves from this material matrix, the gunas are present in varying proportions in all manifest reality, just as the three primary colors are present in all other colors produced from them. As one can create an unlimited variety of hues by simply manipulating the relative proportions of red, yellow, and blue, so the unlimited forms of this world, as well as psychological dispositions of all beings, are the product of the interaction and intermixture of the guas. The Mahabharata states that as one can light thousands of lamps from one lamp, so Prakti can produce hundreds of thousands of transformations of the guas, 12, 301, 15 to 16. For our present purposes, the Siddha, as a product of matter, also consists of the three guas, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Although all of Prakti, including the cosmological and physical aspect of the universe, is also a product of the three guas, the yoga tradition is interested in their psychic aspect. The guas are usually portrayed, and perhaps best understood in the context of yoga, by their psychological manifestations. Indeed, Dasgupta translates them as feelings 42. Sattva, the purest of the guas when manifested in the Siddha, is typically characterized, among a number of things, by lucidity, tranquility, wisdom, discrimination, detachment, happiness, and peacefulness. Rajas, by hankering, energetic endeavor, power, restlessness, and all forms of movement and creative activity, and Tamas, the gua least favorable for yoga, by ignorance, delusion, disinterest, lethargy, sleep, and disinclination toward constructive activity. The Bhagavad Gita, 14, 17, and 18, presents a wide range of symptoms connected with each of the guas. 43 makes the useful observation that the guas are in continual tension with each other, one gua becoming prominent in an individual for a while and suppressing the others, only to be dominated in turn by the emergence of one of the other guas. Bhagavad Gita 14. 10. One of the goals of yoga meditation, as discussed repeatedly in the traditional literature, is to maximize the presence of the gua of sattva in the mind and minimize those of rajas and tamas. According to schematophysics, all three guas are inherently present in all the material by-products of Prakti including the Siddha, so rajas and tamas can never be eliminated, merely minimized or, at best, reduced to a latent and unmanifest potential. Clearly, sattva is the gua most conducive indeed, indispensable to the yogic enterprise, but while rajas and tamas are universally depicted as obstacles to yoga, a certain amount of each gua is indispensable to embodied existence. Without tamas, for example, there would be no sleep, without rajas, no digestion, or even the energy to blink an eye. Nonetheless, yoga is overwhelmingly about cultivating or maximizing sattva. Another way of putting this is that sattva should control whatever degree of rajas and tamas are indispensable to healthy survival, sleeping for 6 or 7 hours, for example, rather than 10, eating a modest amount of food, rather than gorging, etc. The etymological meaning of sattva is the nature of being. This indicates material reality in its purest state, and is characterized by the desirable qualities of discrimination, lucidity, and illumination, since it is sattva that can reveal matter for what it is before rajas and tamas cause it to transform. On the other hand, rajas and tamas are the active influences in the production of the changing states of the mind and fluctuations. Fluctuations of thought, the vitas mentioned in the sutra, by disrupting the siddha's placid and lucid aspect of sattva. Vyasa states that when rajas and tamas become activated, the mind is attracted to thoughts of the sense objects. 44 But both direct the consciousness of the soul, the pure Purua self, outward, drawing it into the external world and thus into awareness of action and reaction, the cycle of birth and death, in short, Sasra. 45 When all trace of tamas and rajas is stilled, however, the mind attains the highest potential of its nature, which is sattva, illumination, peacefulness, and discernment. When the siddha mind attains the state of sattva, the distinction between the ultimate conscious principle, the Purua soul, and even the purest and most subtle, but nonetheless unconscious, states of prakti, matter, become revealed. Buddhi, intelligence, the subtlest product of prakti, is the aspect of the mind that produces such discrimination when manifesting its highest potential of sattva and suppressing its inherent potential of rajas and tamas. When freed from the obscuration of these other two debilitating gunas, which divert consciousness from its source, purua, and into the external world of objects and internal world of thought, the pure sattva nature of the mind redirects consciousness inward toward this inner self. It is like a mirror that, freed from the coverings of dirt, can now reflect things clearly, say the commentators, and can ultimately reflect the true nature of the soul back to itself as it is without distortion. The ensuing state of contemplation is known as samprajanata, samadhi, which, while not the ultimate level of samadhi, is the highest level of discriminative thought. In short, the goal of yoga is to eliminate, that is, still, the potential of rajas and tamas, and allow the full potential sattva nature of the mind to manifest. This is another way of conceptualizing the siddha, vitti, nara of this verse. The means prescribed by Patanjali to still the states of mind or fluctuations of thought is meditative concentration, defined as keeping the mind fixed on any particular object of choice without distraction. By concentration, the distracting influences of rajas and tamas are suppressed, and the sattva aspect of the mind can manifest to its full potential. Since sattva is by nature discriminating, it recognizes the distinction between purua and prakrti, the soul, and matter, when not distracted by the other two gunas. But, since sattva is also by nature luminous and lucid, it is able to reflect the soul in an undistorted way, once the disruptive presences of rajas and tamas have been stilled, and thus the soul becomes aware of itself in the mirror of the mind, so to speak. Once the dust has been removed, a person can see his or her true face in the mirror. One of the goals of yoga is for the mind to develop such discrimination and to reflect the true image of the soul to itself. The commentators point out, however, that the very faculty of discrimination, even its ability to distinguish between matter and spirit, is nonetheless a feature of the guna of sattva, and sattva itself is still an aspect of prakrti matter. The point is that discrimination is not a function of the soul, the innermost conscious self. The soul, notes Vyasa, the pure and eternal power of consciousness, never changes, a fundamental axiom of Indic thought in general. It does not transform when in contact with states of mind. Rather, consciousness passively pervades and illuminates objects, whether in the form of gross external sense objects or subtle internal thoughts, including the higher stage of discrimination, just as light passively reveals gross and subtle objects in a dark room and yet is not affected by them. Hariharananda points out that the consciousness of the soul, siddhi, sakti, is pure, infinite, immutable, detached, and illuminating. Therefore, as Vijanabhiku outlined in the last sutra, discriminative intelligence, even the ultimate pure sattvic act of discrimination, which is recognition of the distinction between the soul and the subtlest aspect of matter, although indispensable in the yogi's progress, still connects the soul to matter, albeit in its subtlest aspect. It, too, must eventually be transcended for full liberation to manifest. As Akara puts it, the mind sees the limitation in its own nature and deconstructs itself. When lead is burned with gold, says Bhojaraja, it not only burns away the impurities in gold, but burns itself away too. Discrimination discerns that it itself is not the final aspect of being and pushes the siddha to dissolve itself and transcend discerning thought altogether so as to reveal the ultimate consciousness beyond. There is thus a still higher goal in yoga beyond discrimination. When the mind restrains even the ability to discriminate, continues vyasa, and exists in an inactive state where all thoughts remain only in potential but not active form, in other words, when all thoughts have been stilled, nara, one has reached a state of mind where nothing is cognized. All cognition, after all, is connected to some external reality, since cognition requires a subject, the cognizer, and an object of cognition distinct from or external to the subject. With no further distractions including discrimination and even the reflection of itself in the mirror of the sattvic buddhi intelligence, consciousness can now abide in its own autonomous nature, the actual soul itself, purua. This is the samadhi called asamprajanata, the state of awareness in which nothing can be discerned except the pure self. In this stage, the mind, which is ultimately an interface between the purua and the external world, becomes redundant, and can be discarded by the yogi upon attaining full liberation. 46 This is the ultimate goal of yoga and thus of human existence. This stage, however, must be preceded by samprajanata, samadhi, uninterrupted meditation, that is, concentration on an external object, which, by definition is a product of matter, so that the states of mind and fluctuations of thought mentioned in the sutra can first be fully stilled. Bhojaraja raises a possible objection to the existence of purua, the soul, which is most likely an implicit reference to Buddhism, although it could in principle apply to the Nyaya and Vaidika schools. If the soul, or pure consciousness, has no object of consciousness, then would it not cease to exist altogether, like fire ceases to exist when the wood upholding it is destroyed? In other words, if the vitas, fluctuations of thought, are eliminated, then what would consciousness be conscious of? Buddhists hold that the human persona consists of 5 sheaths, skandhas, 47 one of which is consciousness itself, but none of these are eternal or autonomous, as almost all Hindu philosophical thought considers the purua, or conscious self, to be. There is thus a fundamental and intractable difference between Buddhism and Hindu and Jain philosophies on this point. For Buddhists, when the objects of consciousness are removed, so is consciousness. There is thus no ultimate, eternal, essential entity such as a purua, soul, that is separable from an object of consciousness. Indeed, clinging to such notions of an autonomous self is the very cause of sasra. Buddhist theologians used the analogy of the wood and fire mentioned by Bhojaraja to argue that consciousness is generated by an object. It is not an entity sui generis with an independent existence. One cannot have consciousness that is not conscious of some object, any more than one can have fire without a substratum such as wood. 48 Even the orthodox Nyaya and Vaidika schools, which do accept the existence of an autonomous purua, hold that when the purua becomes liberated and uncoupled from the mind and the objects of the senses, it ceases to be conscious. They, too, hold that consciousness requires contact with the mind as an external object in order to manifest in the Atman. It does not manifest independently. 49 To answer such objections, says Bhojaraja, Patanjali offers the next sutra. 3 Tada draw or svarapi vasthanam tada, then, at that point, draw, of the seer, of the soul, svarapi, in its own real essential nature, avasthanam, abiding, remaining, being absorbed in. When that is accomplished, the seer abides in its own true nature. There are various terms in Hindu philosophical thought to refer to the soul according to context or the partiality of different texts and schools, Atman being perhaps the most commonly encountered. 50 The yoga tradition in general favors purua, but Patanjali here uses the genitive case of dra, the seer, from the root di, to see, a term he uses on several occasions throughout the text, and, indeed, along with other cognates of the root di, is used almost as often as purua. 51 By seeing, he does not intend the gross power of sight as manifest through the physical organ of sight, but as a metaphor for consciousness itself, which sees in the sense of exhibiting awareness. Having stated in the last sutra that yoga means the cessation of all thought, Patanjali now immediately reassures his audience. Some might worry that cessation of thought, the elimination of all objects of consciousness, entails the cessation of the subject of consciousness, purua, itself. After all, our only experience of reality is one mediated by the thinking process. Does the elimination of thought entail the elimination of experience and of existence itself? Is it existential suicide? What happens to the purua self, asks Vyasa, when the mind is void of content, as prescribed in the last sutra? Vijanabhika rhetorically considers 3 possibilities that might transpire once all the vitas, states of mind, have been removed. 1. Does the purua soul remain as pure consciousness that is conscious only of itself? 2. Does it remain unconscious, like a log of wood, becoming conscious only when confronted by a state of mind, as held by the followers of the Nyaya and Vaidika schools? 52. Or 3. Does it cease to exist like a lamp on the destruction of the wick, as held by followers of the materialistic Carvaka school? 53. The Yoga school subscribes to the first view. Once freed from its association with the states of the mind, the soul can abide in its own nature, the highest state of pure consciousness, asamprajanata, samadhi. It is devoid even of knowledge, says Vijanabhikkhu, since knowledge implies an object of knowledge and thus requires a connection with the states of mind and the external world. In fact, Vyasa and the commentators make the point that the soul has always abided in its own nature, even though, when it is absorbed in the outgoing mind and the world of thoughts and sense objects, it appears not to be. The nature of the soul is pure consciousness, just as, says Akara, the nature of the sun is and has always been to shine. It needs no external instrument to shine, nor does it exert any effort to do so. Indeed, it has no alternative but to shine. Similarly, it is the inherent and inescapable nature of Purua to be conscious. To illustrate the nature of the soul as pure consciousness alone, devoid of content, the commentators often refer to the example of a pure transparent crystal used frequently, and variously, in philosophical discourse to illustrate the relationship between consciousness and the mind, or between the mind and its object. When a red flower is placed next to a crystal, the flower's color is reflected in the crystal, and so the crystal itself appears to be red. The true nature of the crystal, however, is never actually red, nor is it affected or changed by the flower in any way even while it reflects the flower, nor does it disappear when the flower is removed. 54. Similarly, consciousness reflects or illuminates external objects and internal thoughts, vittas, but is not itself affected by them. Purua, although an autonomous entity separable from the citta with its vittas placed in its vicinity, is as if colored by them. Since its awareness animates the citta, which is colored, it is consequently, and understandably, misidentified with the vittas by the citta. But in actuality it is not tainted by them, nor does it disappear upon the disappearance of the objects of consciousness. As a crystal is essentially an autonomous entity separable from the red flower placed in its vicinity and retains its pure transparent nature when separated from the flower, so consciousness is an autonomous entity separable from the citta with its vittas placed in its vicinity, and thus retains its pure nature of awareness when detached from the citta through the practice of yoga. The commentaries frequently utilize another example favored by the Vedanta school to illustrate a related point. Mother of pearl does not give up its own essential nature simply because someone mistakes it for the actual pearl itself. Likewise, consciousness does not change its nature simply because it may be confounded with the physical body or the changing states of the mind and intelligence. The Santi Parvan section of the Mahabharata abounds in similes illustrating the continued existence of Purua when apart from its Pirtic encapsulation. 55. It is like a silkworm that continues to exist after the destruction of the cell made by its threads, a deer that abandons its horn, or a snake its slough after shedding it, a bird that goes elsewhere when the tree on which it is perched falls, 12,212.47-49, or a fish and the water that surrounds it, 12,303.17. Elsewhere, the epic compares the direct vision of the soul within the body indicated by the sutra to the perception of a lamp blazing forth from a pot, 12,187.44, the effulgent sun, a smokeless flame, a streak of lightning in the sky, 12,232.18, or the streak of gold in a stone, 12,198.4. 4 Viti, Sarapyamitaratra Viti, fluctuation, Sarapyam, identification, Itaratra, otherwise, at other times otherwise, at other times, the seer is absorbed in the changing states of the mind. Patanjali states here that at other times, that is, when not abiding in its own nature as pure consciousness devoid of content, the seer is absorbed, Sarapyam, in the Vitas, the mind's changing states. Vyasa calls the soul the master and the mind its property. He compares the mind to a magnet that attracts iron within its proximity, the consciousness of Purua. The mind serves its master, the soul, by presenting objects of experience in the form of Vitas. When these ever-changing states of mind are presented to the soul becomes conscious of them, but is mistakenly identified with them by the Siddha, and thereby appears affected by them. This misidentification, or ignorance, of Vidya, is the cause of the soul's apparent bondage in the physical world of matter. Vaikaspati Misra repeats the analogy of someone looking in a dirty mirror, identifying with the dirty reflection, and then becoming anxious thinking he or she is dirty. Likewise, when one is not aware of the distinction between consciousness and the mind, one wrongly attributes the states of the mind to the self. The cause of the person's anxiety, frustrations, and experiences is misidentification with something that he or she is not. The notion of misidentifying the true self with a false reflection goes back to the Upanishads. In the Chandogya Upanishad, 8-12, there is a charming narrative about Indra, lord of the celestials, and Vairoka, lord of the demons. Upon hearing that by attaining the Atman, one conquers the universe, 56, the two rivals approached the sage Prajapati for instruction as to where to find this Atman. Perceiving their misguided intent for this enterprise, their interest was in gaining control over the universe, for which the gods and demons are perennially battling. Prajapati decides to test them. He tells them that they can find the Atman by looking into a pan of water. Peering into the waters, the two see their bodies reflected back. They take their leave, thinking that their bodies are this Atman, and, while Vairoka remains content with this surface realization, Indra sees the inadequacy of this view of the Atman and so returns to Prajapati. I see no worth in this, he complains, for this self will die when the body dies. Prajapati then takes him through progressively more subtle understandings of the self until he teaches him the true nature of Atman. Although the mind is actually inert and unconscious, say the commentators, as a result of being permeated by the consciousness of the soul, its states and fluctuations appear to be states of the true self and are as if experienced by the self. Recall the analogy of a dark object appearing to be luminous due to contact with an illuminating lamp. And so, says Vaikaspati Misra, the soul, which has no misconceptions, appears to have misconceptions and, although completely pure and transcendent, appears to be affected by mundane states of mind such as pleasure, pain, or delusion. This is like the phenomenon of a lake appearing to have trees on it due to the reflection of the trees on its bank, says Vijanabhiku. Bhojaraja gives the well-known illustration of the moon appearing to be altered and rippled when reflected on rippling water, but it is the water, not the moon, that constantly fluctuates due to the wind. Similarly, the mind is constantly experiencing and processing the forms of sense objects through the senses. It is thus constantly changing, like the flame of a candle, says Vijanabhiku, and, depending on the experiences of the moment, producing temporary states such as happiness, distress, etc. The self, although pure, is then misidentified with these changing states of the mind, due to proximity, and appears also to be affected. It seems to experience the emotions of the mind triggered by the senses and their objects, and thus to be the enjoyer or sufferer of the things of this world. In reality it is not affected, any more than the moon is affected by the ripples on its reflection in water. Vijanabhika quotes the Gita, one who sees that all activities are being performed by Prakti, and that the self is not the doer, truly sees. 13:29. 57 Akara here alludes to the image of a dancing girl in the Skikarikas, the primary text for the Ski school, as a dancer ceases from the dance after having been seen by the audience, so also Prakti ceases after having manifested herself to the Purua, licks. In the same vein, a more modern analogy comes to mind for the process by which Prakti is conjoined with Purua. Consider a group of people watching a film. The film itself consists of just a sequence of inert flickering images and sounds, which are nothing more than light particles and frequency waves material energy. The people watching the film, however, can become so absorbed in this spectacle of light and sound that they forget their own existence. If the film is a good 1, 2, or 3 hours can pass during which the viewers forget about their real lives and personal issues they are undergoing, such as mental anxieties or fears, or bodily needs, or aches and pains. Moreover, the viewers can become so wrapped up in the illusory world of the film that they experience, let us suppose, sadness when the hero or heroine is killed, or happiness when hero and heroine live happily ever after. In other words, the viewers forget their own separate existences and experience emotions produced by intense identification with the illusory and separate world of the film. Indeed, a good performance, and this is also the case in classical Hindu dramaturgy, aims to stir precisely such absorption and identification. When the film is over, the viewers are thrust back into their own realities. They are suddenly returned to the world of their own problems. Perhaps they become aware of being hungry or thirsty. In the same way, due to the mind's ignorance and illusion, the soul appears absorbed in the lights and sounds and emotions of the external objective world and forgetful of its own real nature as pure consciousness, even though it is merely the witness of all these, which are actually taking place in the mind's vittas. Yoga is about stilling the vittas, stopping the film midway so that the mind can realize that the emotions, fears, happiness, pains, births and deaths, etc. it has been experiencing do not exist in the soul but are the inert flickerings and permutations of the material spectacle. Thus yoga is ultimately about liberation from the external material world, or, in traditional Hindu terms, from samsara, the cycle of birth and death. Vaikaspati Misra raises the question of the cause of the soul's association with the mind in the first place, in other words, the cause of ignorance. It is eternal, he answers, like the relationship between seed and sprout. Almost all schools of Indic philosophy conceive of ignorance as eternal and do not speculate over any first impetus that caused the individual to be associated with ignorance and samsara. As the Buddha is reputed to have said, if a man is shot by an arrow, it is useless to inquire as to the nature of the arrow, its point of origin, etc. One should more profitably first remove the arrow. 58 Likewise, for one drowning in the ocean of birth and death, samsara, it is fruitless to speculate as to how one originally fell in. It would be more productive to find first a means to get out. Such a means, of course, is yoga. 5 Vitaya Pakataya Klikli Vitaya, the changing states of mind, Pakataya, fivefold, Klaya, detrimental, harmful, damaging, afflicted, Akli, non-detrimental, unafflicted. There are 5 kinds of changing states of the mind, and they are either detrimental or non-detrimental to the practice of yoga. Patanjali defined yoga in I. 2 as Siddha, Vitti, Nara, and now dedicates Sutras I. 5 to 12 to discussing the Vittas and I. 13 to 16 to discussing Nara. We here get a sense of the systematic nature of the Sutra traditions, in contrast to the more spontaneous but unsystematic nature of the earlier Upanishadic corpus from which a number of knowledge systems stemmed. As has been noted, Vitti is used frequently throughout the Yoga Sutras essentially to refer to any sensual impression, thought, idea, cognition, psychic activity, or mental state whatsoever. Since the mind is never static but always active and changing, Vittas are constantly being produced and thus constantly absorb the consciousness of Purva away from its own pure nature, channeling it out into the realm of subtle or gross prakti. Vijanabhika compares Vittas to flames of a fire or waves of the sea. In other words, if the Siddha is the sea, the Vittas are its waves, the never-ending but ever-changing temporary forms and permutations produced by the constant flux of the tides, undercurrents, and eddies of the Siddha. In I. 2, Patanjali defined yoga as the complete cessation of all Vittas. Here, he addresses the consequent question, What are these vittas that must be eliminated? There are 5 categories, Pakataya, of vittas, which will be discussed in the following sutras. Patanjali indicates that these can be either akliya, conducive, at least initially, to the ultimate goal of yoga, or klaya, detrimental. Vyasa states that the detrimental vittas are caused by the 5 klesas, the impediments to the practice of yoga: ignorance, ego, attachment, aversion, and clinging to life, that will be discussed in 2. 3. The term for detrimental, klaya, comes from the same root as klesa, kles, to trouble or torment. These types of mental states are detrimental to the goals of yoga because they are the fertile soil from which the seeds of karma sprout. The klaya, vittas culminate in bondage. They are essentially the products of rajas and tamas. Akliya, vittas are sattvic and have the opposite effect. They are born of insight and culminate in liberation. When under the influence of the detrimental vittas, the mind becomes attracted or repelled by sense objects drawing its attention. In its attempt to attain that which attracts it, and avoid that which repels it, the mind provokes action, karma, which initiates a vicious reactive cycle. Karma, from the root k, to do or make, literally means work, but inherent in the Indic concept of work, or any type of activity, is the notion that every action breeds a reaction. 59 Thus karma refers not only to an initial act, whether benevolent or malicious, but also to the reaction it produces, pleasant or unpleasant in accordance with the original act, which ripens for the actor either in this life or a future one. Hence, as will be seen in 2:13-14, people are born into different socio-economic situations, and pleasant or unpleasant things happen to them throughout life in accordance with their own previous actions. This cycle of action and reaction, or sasra, is potentially eternal and unlimited, since not only does any one single act breed a reaction, but the actor must then react to this reaction, causing a reaction, which in turn fructifies and provokes reactions, and so on ad infinitum. Thus, since the vicious cycle of action and reaction for just one solitary momentary act is potentially unlimited, and since one has to act at every moment of one's life, even blinking or breathing is an act, the storehouse of karma is literally unlimited. Since these reactions and reactions cannot possibly be fitted into one life, they spill over from one lifetime to the next. It is in an attempt to portray the sheer unlimited and eternal productive power of karma that Indic thinkers, both Hindu and Buddhist, use such metaphors as the ocean of birth and death. Thus, karma, which keeps consciousness bound to the external world and forgetful of its own nature, is generated by the vittas, and the vittas, in turn, are produced by the klesas. The akliya non-detrimental mental vittas, on the other hand, are produced by the sattvic faculty of discrimination that seeks to control the influence of rajas and tamas and thereby the detrimental vittas that they produce. Vyasa notes that this type of vitti is beneficial even if situated in a stream of detrimental vittas. 60 In other words, for the novice struggling to control his or her mind, even if the emergence of sattva occurs only periodically, it is always a beneficial occurrence, and it can be gradually increased and strengthened by a yogic lifestyle. The reverse also holds true, adds Vyasa. Detrimental vittas also can surface periodically in a predominantly sattvic siddha, hence the Gita's statement in 2:60 that the senses can carry away the mind even of a man of discrimination. Vaikaspati Misra mentions activities such as the practice of yoga and the cultivation of desirelessness born from the study of scripture as non-detrimental, that is, mental activities beneficial to the goal of yoga. These actions, like any actions, produce seeds of reactions and create saskras, discussed further below, but these seeds are sattvic and beneficial to the path of yoga and the ultimate goal of samadhi. In time, and with practice, these seeds accumulate such that they eventually transform the nature of the mind. The mind then becomes more and more sattvic, or illuminated and contemplative, such that the beneficial vittas eventually automatically suppress any stirrings of rajas and tamas, the detrimental vittas, until the latter remain only as inactive potencies. When the Siddha manifests its pure sattva potential, it becomes like the Atman, says Vyasa. He means that, becoming aware of the true nature of reality, it no longer distracts the Purua with permutations of Prakti, the world of Sasra, but provides it insight into its true nature and reflects Purua undistort, allowing it to contemplate its true nature as per the mirror analogy. Ramnanda Sarasvati notes here that, essentially, the Siddha mind is nothing but saskras, mental imprints or impressions, not to be confused with sasra, the cycle of birth and death. Saskras are a very important feature of yoga psychology. Every sensual experience or mental thought that has ever been experienced forms a saskra, an imprint, in the Siddha mind. Essentially, any vitti leaves its copy on the Siddha before fading away, like a sound is imprinted on a tape recorder or an image on film. The mind is thus a storehouse of these recorded saskras, deposited and accumulated in the Siddha over countless lifetimes. However, it is important to note that these saskras are not just passive imprints but vibrant latent impulses that can activate under conducive circumstances and exert influence on a person's thoughts and behaviors. Vyasa notes that there is thus a cycle of vittas and saskras. Vittas, that is, sense experiences and thoughts, etc., and their consequent actions, are recorded in the Siddha as saskras, and these saskras eventually activate consciously or subliminally, producing further vittas. These vittas then provoke action with its corresponding reaction, which in turn are recorded as saskras, and the cycle continues. Memories in Hindu psychology, as we will see in I-11, are considered to be vivid saskras from this lifetime, which are retrievable, while the notion of the subconscious in Western psychology corresponds to other less retrievable saskras, accumulated, in Hinduism, primarily in previous lives, which remain latent as subliminal impressions. Saskras also account for such things as personality traits, habits, compulsive and addictive behaviors, etc. For example, a particular type of experience, say smoking a cigarette, is imprinted in the Siddha as a saskra, which then activates as a desirable memory or impulse, provoking a repetition of this activity, which is likewise recorded, and so on until a cluster or grove of saskras of an identical or similar sort is produced in the Siddha, gaining strength with each repetition. The stronger or more dominant such a cluster of saskras becomes, the more it activates and imposes itself upon the consciousness of the individual, demanding indulgence and perpetuating a vicious cycle that can be very hard to break. The reverse, of course, also holds true with benevolent akliya, vittas. One can become addicted, so to speak, to benevolent yogic activities and lifestyle by constant repetition. Klesas, vittas, saskras, and karma are thus all interconnected links in the chain of sasra. Through the practice of yoga, the yogi attempts to supplant all the rajasic and tamasic saskras with sattvic ones until these, too, are restricted in the higher states of meditative concentration. This is because while sattvic saskras, the non-detrimental vittas, mentioned by Patanjali in the sutra, are conducive to liberation, they nonetheless are still vittas and thus an external distraction to the pure consciousness of the Atman. Of course, as Vijayanabhika points out, all vittas, including sattvic ones, are ultimately detrimental from the absolute perspective of the Purua, as they bind consciousness to the world of matter, so the notions of detrimental and non-detrimental are from the relative perspective of sasra. The detrimental, rajasic and tamasic, vittas cause pain, and the non-detrimental, sattvic, ones at least lead in the direction of liberation, even though they too must eventually be given up. Vijayanabhika quotes the Bhagavata Pura here to make the point, other things the obstacles to yoga must be eliminated by sattva, and then sattva is eliminated by sattva. 11. 25.20. Also, vittas that are truly and literally akliya, not subject to any ignorance at all, can point only to the state of jivanmutta, liberated while still embodied. This verse thus gives a clear indication that it is possible to act in the world in one's praktic body and mind from an enlightened perspective free from ignorance. I. 6 Prama, Viparya, Vikalpa, Nidra, Samtiya Prama, epistemology, source of right knowledge, Viparya, error, Vikalpa, imagination, fancy, Nidra, sleep, Samtiya, memory. These 5 Vittas are right knowledge, error, imagination, sleep, and memory. The Vittas, which bind Purua to the world of Sasra, are enumerated here. Patanjali lists 5 distinct types of Vittas. The implication, in essence, is that the human mind finds itself in one of these 5 states at any given moment. According to the yoga tradition, all possible mental states that can be experienced can be categorized as manifestations of one of these 5 types of Vittas. Any other states of mind that one might conceive of would be considered by the yoga tradition as a subset of one of these 5 essential categories. The commentators reserve their comments for the ensuing sutras, which explain each of these items in turn. I. 7 Pratyanam and Gam Pramna Pratyaka, sense perception, Anumana, inference, logic, Gam, testimony, verbal communication, Pramna, epistemology. Right knowledge consists of sense perception, logic, and verbal testimony. The first of the 5 Vittas to be discussed is Prama, the central concern of epistemology. That is, what sources constitute valid knowledge of an object, the methods of attaining accurate information about reality. 61 Philosophy and, of course, science. After all, sees itself as dealing with physical verifiable truths, have as their goals the attainment of knowledge about reality, so it is standard in Indic philosophical discourse for scholastics to state which methods of attaining such knowledge of reality they accept as valid. The Yoga school accepts 3 sources of receiving knowledge, as does the Skya tradition, Skyakarika 4, but other philosophical schools accept differing numbers from 1 to 6. 62 The first method of attaining valid knowledge listed by Patanjali is sense perception. We can know something to be true or valid if we experience it through one or more of our senses, if we see, smell, touch, hear, or taste it. So, for example, you know this book is real because you see it and feel it. Akara notes that sense perception, empiricism, is placed first on the list of pramas because the other pramas are dependent on it. 63 Vyasa defines sense perception as the state or condition of the mind, vitti, that apprehends both the specific, vaya, and generic, samanya, nature of an external object through the channels of the 5 senses. The generic and specific nature of objects are categories especially associated with the Vaidika school of Hindu philosophy and are technical ways of attempting to analyze physical reality. The generic nature of a dog that one might happen to come upon, for example, is that it belongs to the canine species. The specific nature is that which demarcates it from other members of this generic category, that it is, let us say, a ginger Irish Terrier. Technically speaking, vaya is what differentiates ultimate irreducible entities such as the smallest subatomic particles of matter from each other, but Vyasa is using the term in a more general sense, since dogs, as all material objects, are made up of conglomerates of atoms. 64. When one sees a particular dog, the mind typically apprehends both its generic and specific natures. 65 This is accomplished by the siddha encountering a sense object through the senses and forming an impression of this object, a vitti. 66 More specifically, the tamasic natures of sense objects imprint themselves upon the mind and are then illuminated in the mind by the mind's sattvic nature. Due to pervading the mind, the Puru's awareness then becomes conscious of this mental impression, as if it were taking place within itself, indistinguishable from itself. In actual fact, the impression is imprinted on the siddha, mind, which is pervaded by consciousness. Vaikaspati Misra raises a question here. If the impression is imprinted on the mind, which, according to the metaphysics of yoga, is a totally separate entity from the Purua soul, then how is it that the latter is aware of it? Or, as he puts it, if an axe cuts a cat or a tree, it is not a plaka tree that is thereby cut. In other words, if an impression Impression is something that is made on the mind, then how does it end up being made on the purua? Here, again, Vaikaspati Misra introduces the analogy of the mirror. It is the mind and intelligence, not the soul, that take the form of the object as a result of sense perception. According to the reflection model of awareness, consciousness is reflected in the intelligence due to their proximity and then is misidentified with the reflection by the mind. This reflection, in turn, is altered according to the form assumed by the intelligence, just as a reflection appears dirty if the mirror is dirty. Thus, since the mind and intelligence have taken the form of the object in question, consciousness sees its own reflection as containing that form. This corresponds to the analogy of the moon appearing rippled when reflected in rippling water. According to the non-reflection model, awareness simply pervades the citta just as it pervades the body and is misidentified as being non-different from the forms of citta in the same way as it is misidentified with the form of the body. According to either manner of conceptualization, this misidentification of the awareness of purua with the forms of the intellect is the essence of ignorance. Moving on to the second prama, source of receiving valid knowledge, mentioned by Patanjali in the sutra, Vyasa defines anumana, inference, as the assumption that an object of a particular category shares the same qualities as other objects in the same category, qualities that are not shared by objects in different categories. He gives the rather clumsy example of the moon and stars, which belong to the category of moving objects because they are seen to move, but mountains belong to a category of immobile objects, because they have never been seen to move. Thus, if one sees an unfamiliar mountain or hill, one can infer that it will not move, because other known objects in this category, all mountains and hills with which one is familiar, do not move. The more classical example of inference among Hindu logicians is that fire can be inferred from the presence of smoke. Since wherever there is smoke, there is invariably fire causing it, the presence of fire can be inferred upon the perception of smoke even if the actual fire itself is not perceived. So if one sees clouds of smoke billowing forth from a distant mountain, one can say with certainty that there must be fire on it, even if one cannot actually see the blaze itself. It is in this regard that inference, anumana, differs from the first source of knowledge, pratyaka, sense perception. Pratyaka requires that one actually see the fire. In anumana, the fire itself is not actually seen, but its presence is inferred from something else that is perceived, smoke. 67 The principle here is that there must always be an absolute and invariable relationship, vyapti, concomitance, between the thing inferred, say, the fire, and the reason on which the inference is made, the presence of smoke. In other words, wherever there is or has ever been smoke, there must at all places and at all times always be or have been fire present as its cause with no exceptions. If these conditions are met, the inference is accepted as a valid source of knowledge. If exceptions to the rule can be found, even one instance of smoke ever that does or did not have fire as its cause, then the inference is invalid. Finally, agama, verbal testimony, the third source of valid knowledge accepted by Patanjali, is the relaying of accurate information through the medium of words by a trustworthy person who has perceived or inferred the existence of an object, to someone who has not. Vyasa describes a trustworthy person as someone whose statements cannot be contradicted. Vaikaspati Misra adds that such a person should have keen sense organs and be trustworthy and compassionate, and Vijanabhiku, that a reliable or trustworthy person is one who is free from defects such as illusion, laziness, deceit, dull witness, and so forth. The words of such a reliable authority enter the ear and produce an image, vitti, in the mind of the hearer that corresponds to the vitti experienced by the trustworthy person. The person receiving the information in this manner has neither personally experienced nor inferred the existence of the object of knowledge, but valid knowledge of the object is nonetheless achieved, which distinguishes the source of knowledge from the two discussed previously. The most important category of valid knowledge in the form of agama, verbal testimony, is divine scripture, which is also referred to as sriti, 68 that which is heard, or sabda, the word. Since scriptures are considered to have been uttered by trustworthy persons in the form of enlightened sages and divine beings, their status as trustworthy sources of knowledge is especially valuable. In order to elaborate on this, Vaikaspati Misra raises the issue of how sacred scriptures can be considered valid given that all accurate verbal knowledge must itself originally come either from perception or inference. Hence the Karvaka and Vaidika schools do not even consider them separate sources of knowledge. 69, but scriptures deal with certain subjects that no human being has either seen or inferred, such as the existence of heavenly realms. Vaikaspati Misra responds that the truths of scripture have been perceived by God, Isvara, thus divine scripture, too, is based on perception, and God, quips Ramnanda Sarasvati, is surely a trustworthy person. However, Vaikaspati Misra, in his commentary to the Sakya Karika, v. precludes the blind acceptance of scripture by qualifying that revelation may be a useful means of attaining knowledge only if it has a solid foundation, contains no internal contradictions, is supported by reason, and is accepted by people in general. Vyasa makes a telling comment in I. 32 relevant to the hierarchy of yoga epistemology. Perception is superior to any other sources of knowledge. Indeed, the other sources of knowledge are based on it. If we consider the syllogism "there is fire on the mountain because there is smoke," even though the fire is not seen by direct perception and therefore an inference is required to establish its existence, this inference is dependent on perception insofar as the sign, liga, of the fire, namely, smoke, is perceived. So valid inferences are also dependent on perception. And, as indicated, verbal authority is predicated on the original perception of the object of information by the relator of the information. Additionally, it can be argued that accepting knowledge from a verbal authority is nothing other than making an inference. One makes an inference that a verbal authority is reliable and does not counter perceivable data. Verbal authority too, then, is indirectly derived from direct perception. Therefore some schools of thought, like that associated with the materialist Karvaka, accept the need for only one prama, that of sense perception. The Yoga school accepts three sources but is very clear that it considers pratyaka the highest, not just because the other pramas depend on it, but, as will become clearer in I. 49, because it is the only way of truly knowing the essential nature of an object. Different schools of thought prioritize different pramas. The Nyaya school features Anumana, dedicating itself for centuries to refining categories of logic, and Skya, too, was associated with this epistemology. 70 The Vedanta school occupied itself with Agama, Vedanta Sutras I. 1.3, dedicating itself to the interpretation and systematization of the Upanishads and the Vedanta Sutras derived from them. The MMA with Makron SA with Makron school, 2, prioritized Agama and became especially associated with developing hermeneutics, the methods of scriptural interpretation. 71 While Patanjali accepts Agama as a valid source of knowledge, he does not quote or even indirectly refer to a single verse from scripture in his treatise. In contrast with the Vedanta Sutras, which are almost entirely composed of references from the Upanishads. The very fact that he categorizes Agama as a Vitti and thus comparable in one sense with other Vittas such as Viparaya, error, the subject of the next sutra, points to correspondences with aspects of post-enlightenment thought, namely, that verifiable, in this case yogic, experience trumps scripture. This has been termed a radical mystico, yogic orientation. 72 Since, certainly, as with the Enlightenment, such claims would have challenged the mainstream Vedic authority of the day. As for Anumana, while Patanjali uses the source of knowledge on occasion, such as in his arguments against certain Buddhist views, 14-24, clearly almost his entire thrust throughout the sutras is on pratyaka as the ultimate form of knowledge. Anumana and Agama are forms of knowledge, but mediate forms, the truths of which are indirect, where the Yoga tradition bases its claims to authoritativeness on direct, personal experience. It is because of this orientation that yoga is, in my view, destined to remain a perennial source of interest to the empirical dispositions of the modern world. One must also note that there are different types of pratyeka. The commentary on the Skyakarika, the Yukti, Deepika, speaks of yogic perception as well as sensual perception, 38.2. Indeed, several schools make a distinction between apara, pratyeka, conventional perception, and para, pratyeka, supernormal perception, or, as the Skya Sutras put it, external perception, bahaya, pratyeka, and internal perception of bahaya, pratyeka, I. 90. 73. As will become clearer later in the text, the perception of interest to yoga is the latter, that of a supernormal nature. But even the startling claims of omniscience that occur later in the text are relevant only as signposts of experiences that the yogi will encounter on the path of yoga, not as articles of faith. I. 8. Viparyayo mithya, Jainanam added, Rupa, Pradaham Viparyaya, error, Mithya, false, Jainanam, knowledge, added, not that, incorrect, Rupa, form, Pradaham, established in error is false knowledge stemming from the incorrect apprehension of something. Patanjali now proceeds to the second of the 5 different types of vittas, error. Vyasa defines error as considering something to be what it is not, added, Rupa, a state that can be subsequently removed by true knowledge of the actual nature of the thing in question. As an example, he gives the perception of 2 moons. After consuming alcohol, a person may see double. This error of perception nonetheless produces a vitti in the mind of this person, but this vitti differs from vittas produced by valid sources of knowledge insofar as the seeing of 2 moons is an apparent perception that can be contradicted and dismissed by a later accurate perception that there is only 1 moon in reality, whereas valid knowledge cannot be contradicted. Vijanabhiku notes that error is the result of the superimposition of wrong knowledge, mithya, Jainanam, onto an object. In our example, an extra moon is superimposed onto the actual solitary one. The classical example of error, especially among the followers of Vedanta, is mistaking a rope for a snake. If one happens upon a rope on the path as one is walking home at dusk, and imagines it to be a snake, one is superimposing the form of a snake upon something that is not a snake. This is error according to the Yoga school. Different schools of philosophy hold differing views on what constitutes error. 74. The Nyaya school, which especially concerns itself with epistemology. Epistemology, the methods of accurate knowledge, has a similar definition, giving as an example of error considering mother of pearl as containing silver. Specifically, Nyaya defines knowledge, prama, as apprehending an object as it is, correctly identifying the attribute of that object, and error as the opposite, considering an object to have an attribute that in fact it does not have. The mother of pearl does not contain silver. 75. Vyasa considers error to be essentially the 5 kleshas, the impediments to the practice of yoga: ignorance, avidya, ego, attachment, aversion, and clinging to life. However, avidya is the root of the other kleshas, 2, 4, and we will argue in 2, 5 that it is a fundamentally deeper and more subconscious type of ignorance than the surface level error represented in the sutra by Viparaya. I. 9 Sabda, Jainananupati Vastu, Sunya Vikalpa Sabda, words, Jainana, knowledge, Anupati, resulting from, followed in sequence, Vastu, actual object, Na, devoid of, Vikalpa, conceptualization, fancy, imagination. Here, figurative language imagination consists of the usage of words that are devoid of an actual object. The commentators take the third type of vitti, imagination, to be metaphor, words, or expressions that do not correspond to any actual physical reality, vastu, sunya, but are understood in common parlance, sabda, jainana, anupati. When we say consciousness is the essence of purua, Caitanya Puruas Yas Varapam Iti, says Vyasa, we are, strictly speaking, making an incorrect statement. Using the genitive case, as in the essence of purua, implies a distinction between the possessor and the thing possessed, as in the phrase the cow of Citra. But consciousness is not a separate entity owned by another separate entity purua as this phrase suggests. Consciousness is purua, not something owned by purua. Likewise with negative predictions such as the purua has the characteristic of not being born, there is not a factual positive state of not being born, something that does not exist has no sensible existence, yet such phrases do bear meaning. Using language in this way is Vikalpa. Vyasa gives other examples of this nature, 76. But if we, along with the commentators, can extend the technical denotative range of Vikalpa somewhat, perhaps a more straightforward example from English usage might be the sun rises and sets or time flies. The sun doesn't actually either rise or set, nor is there a tangible entity called time flapping about with wings, but common usage has assigned meaning to these imaginary states of affairs, and no one bats an eye when such expressions are uttered. In other words, metaphors and similes might be considered types of Vikalpas. Indeed, Vaikaspati Misra notes that these expressions, which, if dissected to their literal meanings, do not correspond to actual objective reality, are normal everyday expressions and ubiquitous in human language, since language is largely figurative. In this way, although other schools, such as Nyaya and Vaiyika, consider Vikalpa to be a category of error rather than a Vitti in its own right, the Yoga school considers the Vitti of Vikalpa, imagination, to differ essentially from the previous two Vittas. This is because the first Vitti, right knowledge, corresponds to accurate knowledge of an actual objective reality, recognized as such by others, and error corresponds to a misperception or misunderstanding of something, and therefore it is perceived as an error by other people who can see the actual nature of the misunderstood object. Vikalpa, on the other hand, while, like error, referring to an object that lacks actual objective physical reality, yet, unlike the Vitti of error but like the Vitti of right knowledge, is not based on an error of judgment and is intelligible to other people in practice, producing a Vitti impression in the mind of the listener without being perceived as an error or attracting any attention. It thus paradoxically represents a meaningful expression that yet has no actual reality in the real world. It is therefore held to be a different category of Vitti from Prama or Viparaya. We thus see what a meticulous thinker Patanjali is. Let us keep our eye on the ball. In order to understand what Purua is, one has to understand what it is not, I. For it is not the mind. Therefore, Patanjali is directing very careful attention to what the mind is such that the yogi can be clear about what the Purua should not be identified with. The mind can be recognized by what it does. Patanjali is thus identifying the things that the mind does, that is, its functions. Since Vikalpa, conceptual thought, does not fit into the other types of Vittas such as Prama and Viparaya even as it shares features of both of these, he has concluded that it must belong to a category of its own. Vijanabhiku accepts the more common understanding of this Vitti of Vikalpa, the usage of nonsensical expressions such as skyflower, hare's horn, or son of a barren woman, which are the typical motifs in Hindu philosophical discourse that correspond to expressions in English such as pie in the sky. These are all non-existent objects, but they nonetheless produce some sort of an intelligible Vitti in the mind of the listener. It is curious that the commentators do not direct specific attention to more common aspects of imaginative thought, such as daydreaming, fantasy, make-believe, and wishful thinking, which actually occupy major portions of most people's waking attention. Such things might also be considered types of Vikalpas, but, since they depend on the activation of saskras, which are imprints of real things, they overlap with other Vittas, particularly the function of memory, the fifth type of Vitti discussed below, and or error, since they have no reality. 10 Abhava, Pratyaya Lambana Vittir Nidra Abhava, absence, Pratyaya, cause, Alambana, support, basis, Vitti, state of mind, Nidra, Deep sleep is that state of mind which is based on an absence of any content. The commentators acknowledge here that there is some difference of opinion regarding whether or not sleep is an actual vitti. Based on the Chandogya Upanishad, 6. 8.1, the Vedantins do not consider any vitti to be present in the siddha during deep sleep, but that the Atman, or Purua, undisturbed by any siddha vitti in the state of deep sleep, experiences Brahman, Vedanta Sutra I. 4.18, 2. 3.31. Vyasa and the yoga commentators, in contrast, view deep sleep as a type of vitti on the grounds that when one awakes, one remembers that one has either slept well or restlessly or in a stupor. One would not be able to do so, in their view, if these impressions did not relate back to a state of mind that existed during deep sleep. In yoga psychology, memory is the product of saskara, and saskara is caused by experience. Therefore, the memory of having slept well must relate to a state of mind experienced during deep sleep, which is recorded in the siddha as memory, the topic of the next sutra, and remembered upon awakening. This state of mind according to this line of reasoning must therefore pertain to a category of vitti distinct from others. It might be useful to note along with Vaikaspati Misra that the fourth vitti being discussed by Patanjali in this sutra does not refer to the state of mind represented in the dream state. Dream sleep corresponds to the vittis of memory, since it involves the activation of saskaras. Nidra, sleep, then, refers to deep dreamless sleep. It takes place when the tamasic element of the mind densely covers the sattvic nature of buddhi, the intellect. In dream, more rajas is active, and this churns up past saskaras, which produce dream experiences. In deep sleep, rajas is inactive, and so the mind is not stimulated to assume the form of the objects of knowledge, as it does during the waking and dream states, thus Purua is conscious of darkness alone. Another way to put this is that due to the preponderance of tamas, there is a suppression of the other vittas. However, needless to say, while deep sleep can be considered a type of siddha, vitti, nara, cessation of thought, at least of the four vittas other than sleep, since the sattva, or knowledge aspect of the siddha is smothered by tamas, as is any rajasic stirring of siddha, this is not the siddha, vitti, nara defined by Patanjali as the goal of yoga in I. 2. In the samadhi state, sattva is at its maximum, and the yogiya siddha, vitti, nara occurs in full vibrant wakefulness and in complete lucidity as to the nature of reality. In deep sleep, awareness is simply aware of the dense motionless darkness of tamas in which it is enveloped. Additionally, and importantly, this verse informs us that consciousness is eternal, it is never switched off, not even in deep sleep. In deep sleep, it remains fully aware, since it is eternally and inherently fully aware, but its object of awareness is, almost, pure tamas, hence there is nothing to recollect when one awakens, other than whether one has slept well or not. If the tamasic element that covers the intellect during deep sleep is accompanied by a measure of sattva, the commentators inform us, a person feels refreshed and lucid upon awakening. If accompanied by rajas, one feels that one has slept restlessly and one is confused and distracted. If tamas has almost completely dominated sattva and rajas during sleep, one feels sluggish and tired upon awakening. Pointing back to I.3 where Patanjali states that yoga is the cessation of all vittas, which therefore includes deep sleep as well, Vaikaspati Misra notes that sleep, too, can be controlled in samadhi, meditative absorption. And certainly the hagiographies of saints the world over are replete with claims that many indulged in a very minimal amount of sleep. There are two important technical terms introduced in the sutra, pratyaya and alambana. Pratyaya has a number of meanings, two of which are relevant to the sutras. It can mean cause, as it is used in Buddhist sources, which is how Vaikaspati Misra takes it here, as also in I. 1977 elsewhere, 2. 23. 2, 12, 17, 19, 35, and it can also be read here in the sense it refers to the image of an object imprinted on the mind, that is, a cognition. Cognition, which is how it is understood in the Vedanta tradition. In yoga cognition, the powers behind the five senses, jnanendriyas, flow out through the senses with the mind, as the antakara, to grasp their objects, pratyaya, from prati plus I, to go forth, and then imprint images of these objects on the mind, which then presents them to puru as outlined previously via its faculty of buddhi. These imprints or cognitions are pratyayas. 78. Although sometimes used synonymously with viti by the commentators, it differs in my understanding insofar as it represents a singular momentary imprint, while a viti is more a flow of thoughts or images and may contain a series of pratyayas. The second term, alambana, is the support for the mind and refers to any object upon which the yogi has chosen to focus or concentrate the mind. A list of possible alambanas for meditation is presented by Patanjali in I. 23-39. I. 11. Anubhuta, Vyisam Pramoasamti Anubhuta, experienced, Vyaya, sense objects, Asampramoa, not slipping away, retention, Samti, memory. Memory is the retention of images of sense objects that have been experienced. Vyasa notes that memories are generated from and thus dependent on the other types of vitas described in the preceding sutras, right knowledge, error, imagination, and sleep. One has memories of objects of knowledge, error, etc. Therefore, says Vaikaspati Misra, memory is mentioned last on the list of vitas. Nonetheless, the yoga school considers memory a viti in its own right. Patanjali here describes memory as the retention or, more literally, the not slipping away, asampramoa, of an object of experience, anubhuta vyaya. As noted, every object that has ever been experienced forms a saskara, an imprint. In the Siddha mind, the mind forms an impression of an object, called a pratyaya, through the sense organs. As noted in the previous sutra, a pratyaya is the specific content of a viti, a unitary image like the individual still of a movie, where a viti is more a sequence and thus a series of pratyayas, comparable to the reel itself containing the series of stills. Once this pratyaya or active image of this object is no longer of interest to the mind, it becomes an inactive, or latent, saskara. Thus vitas, and their pratyaya content, are retained as saskaras when they fade. A person approaching a red rose, for example, receives an impression through the senses of the sight and smell of a red object of a particular shape with a certain odor. This input is recognized by and imprinted on the mind as a rose, a fragrant member of the flower family. However, even after the mind has moved on to other things, this cognition, or impression remains embedded in the Siddha mind in the form of a saskara, imprint. Since the mind is exposed to numerous sense objects all the time, and has been for numerous lifetimes, there are unlimited saskaras continually being embedded in the Siddha, which are all potentially retrievable. Memory, then, the fifth and final type of viti listed by Patanjali, consists of the retrieval of these saskaras. Memories are the reactivation of the imprints of sense objects that one has experienced and recognized in the past. 79. Vijanabdhika makes a distinction here between memory and recognition. 80. When these saskaras do not slip away, fall into the unconscious, or, in skin categories, when they do not become overly covered by tamas, they constitute memory. The Siddha can perhaps be compared to a lake, and saskara memories to the pebbles at the bottom of the lake. If the lake is peaceful and crystal clear, sattvic, the pebbles are easily visible. If it is choppy, rajasic, less so, and if murky, tamasic, the pebbles become very hard or impossible to perceive. Vyasa states that memory is of two types: real, namely, recollection of things that actually happened, and imagined, such as in dreams, which involve the spontaneous and more random activation of saskaras but are still memories of sorts. Bhojaraja says that the saskaras that activate during dreams do so because of the force of the impression that created them. In other words, they were vivid events. On this topic, Ramnanda Sarasvati raises the question that if all saskras consist of, and only of, events or objects that have been actually experienced, then how can we account for those dreams where one might imagine oneself, for example, as having the body of an elephant? What saskras produce these? Surely one has not had such an experience in real life. Such memories, he answers, are the result of error, which affects the dream state just as it does the waking state. One might add that one cannot dream of, or for that matter even imagine, something that does not exist as a saskra or set of saskras in one siddha, and saskras, in turn, correspond to something one has actually experienced. However, saskras can be clustered together in a way that corresponds to something that has never been experienced in reality, such as a flying elephant or the horns of a hare. What is taking place in such imaginative instances is the merging together of two sets of actual saskras, in other words, one set of memory experiences, recollections of the act of flying or of horns, are superimposed on and blended with other memory imprints, those of an elephant or a hare. As a point of interest, in addition to the fantasy nature of most dreams, Vedanta Sutra 3.2.4 allows that some dreams can also serve as omens of real events. The Jains accept memory, samti, as a prama, i6, in its own right, but this is rejected by the Hindu schools since memory does not present immediate or new knowledge, which prama for these philosophical schools must do, but presents something that has already happened in the past. However, samti is used by Hindus to refer to a category of agama, sacred text, which is a prama. This category of samti includes in practice more or less everything other than the Smriti, or the Vedic corpus 81, the epics, Puras, and sutra traditions including Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. However, since samti sacred texts present themselves, at least nominally, as dependent on or derivative from the Smriti for their authoritativeness, 82 samti texts are not considered prama on the same level as Smriti 3 in orthodox discourse, at least not officially, although in practice, it has been the samti that has determined the beliefs and practices of Hindus throughout the ages. Or, put differently, as in the Vedanta tradition, samti can be accepted as agama, prama to the extent it does not conflict with the Smriti. 84. This concludes the discussion on what constitutes a vitti. According to Vyasa, the 5 types of vittas identified by Patanjali are either experienced as pleasurable in nature, resulting in attachment, sattva, unpleasurable, resulting in aversion, rajas, or deluded, resulting in ignorance, tamas. Of course, as Vijanabhiku notes, from the absolute perspective pleasure also results in pain, because pleasure generates attachment to the object of pleasure, and this attachment ultimately results in pain upon the loss of this object. Attachment also perpetuates sasra, as we will discover in 2ff. One might add here that Patanjali indicated in I5 that these 5 vittas are either klaya, detrimental, or akliya, beneficial, conducive to the goal of yoga. Thus, for example, the vitti of sleep might be considered non-detrimental when it is not excessive but simply adequate for the well-being of the body, but detrimental when in excess of this. The vitti of memory may be non-detrimental when one keeps the goals of yoga in mind, but detrimental when one harps back on past sensual indulgences. Perhaps the hardest vitti to envision in this regard is how error could be sattvic and akliya, conducive to the goal of yoga, but irrespective of the state of one's siddha, if the instruments of the senses are defective, error may nonetheless occur. For example, if he has poor eyesight, even the accomplished yogi will still perceive things erroneously and thus be subject to error. One can play around creatively with other possible scenarios of error being akliya. One might walk into a yoga studio taught by dedicated teachers grounded in Patanjali's teachings, mistaking it for a health spa, but, once there, become inspired to undertake the practices and philosophy of the system, and thus one's initial error becomes conducive to the goals of the yoga. There are certainly plenty of examples in the Puras that might illustrate error from a bhakti, devotional, perspective. In the Bhagavata tradition, the residents of Braj, where Ka spent his childhood, unaware of Ka's divinity, mistook him to be their son, or friend, or lover, etc. But such error is highly favorable to the goal in this yoga tradition and fundamental to its theology of Lila, the pastimes of the incarnation of God in the world, as well as indicative of the extraordinary past life yogic attainments of those residents, which allowed them this opportunity of such intimate association with God in this form. 85 Whatever their nature, says Vyasa, Vittas must be restrained for any type of concentrative state, either samprajanata or asamprajanata, to take place, as Patanjali announced at the beginning of his Sutras. I. 12 Abhyasa, Virjibhitan, Nara Abhyasa, practice, Virajyavyam, dispassion, renunciation, non-attachment, tad, they're the Vitti states of mind, Nara, controlled, restrained. The Vitti states of mind are stilled by practice and dispassion. At the beginning of the text, I. 2. Patanjali defined yoga as siddha, vitti, nara, the restraint of the vittas, the changing states of the mind. Having explained what constitutes a vitti, he now turns his attention to nara, restraint. How, exactly, are the vittas to be restrained? In this sutra he identifies two ingredients necessary for such restraint, practice and dispassion, renunciation. Vijanabhika quotes the Gita here, the mind is undoubtedly fickle and difficult to control, O Arjuna, but it can be controlled by abhyasa, virajyavyam, practice, and dispassion. 6:35. The same two ingredients are indicated by Patanjali in this sutra. As was seen in I. 6. Patanjali's typical method is to introduce a list in one sutra and then explain the items on this list in the subsequent sutras, so his definitions of practice and dispassion follow in the next sutras. Before proceeding to an analysis on practice and dispassion, Vyasa notes that the stream of the siddha, mind, can flow two ways, toward its upliftment or toward its downfall. He analogizes the mind to a river, which normally flows down the channels of the senses toward their objects and into the sea of sasra, the cycle of birth and death. However, by dispassion toward the sense objects, the flow of this river of the mind toward the sea of sasra is checked, and by discrimination, the current of the river is reversed and the mind flows back, away from sasra, and toward realization of the self. By flowing along the course of discrimination, the mind leads to upliftment and ultimate liberation. Contrarily, if it flows along the course of non-discrimination in the form of sensuality, it produces karma, which may be good or bad depending on whether the actions the mind provokes are pious or impious, and perpetuates the vicious cycle of repeated birth and death. By practice and dispassion, the flow of the mind toward sensual attractions, which might entice the mind toward vice, becomes drastically diminished. Rather, by practice, which of course refers to the practice of yoga, the flow of the mind toward higher knowledge becomes unobstructed, and the mind becomes immersed in discrimination. Another way of putting this from the perspective of the gunas is that sattva becomes enhanced and rajas and tamas minimized. Discrimination, dispassion, and the impetus to seek a practice in order to realize truth are inherent in the mind when its sattvic potential is not overwhelmed by rajas and tamas, which are the influences provoking the flow of the mind towards sensuality. Bhojaraja adds that by practice and renunciation, eventually all fluctuating states of the mind, whether sattvic, rajasic, or tamasic, can be controlled. He understands dispassion as the realization by the wise of the negative repercussions of sensuality, which results in avoidance of it. The pursuit of sensual pleasure always bears a hidden price. I. 13 Tatra Stita Yatno Bisa Tatra, of these Abhyasa and Virajya, Stita, in the matter of steadfastness, Yatna, effort, Abhasa, practice. From these, practice is the effort to be fixed in concentrating the mind. Patanjali now describes the first ingredient required to restrain the mind, abhyasa, practice, and defines practice as the effort to concentrate the mind. Vyasa, in turn, defines concentration, 1. Pointedness, as the peaceful flow of the mind when it has become freed from its fluctuating states or vittas. The effort to secure the state is practice. It is important to recognize that a controlled mind is not going to manifest by itself. Effort, yatna, is required. One is reminded here of the comment of Arjuna, who, as a warrior, had no history of serious yoga practice, that the mind is harder to control than the wind since it is fickle, powerful, and obstinate. As noted by Vijayanabhiku in the last sutra, Ka assures him that without doubt the fickle mind is hard to control, but it can be subdued with practice and dispassion. 6. 34-35. In this sutra, Patanjali indicates that this practice requires effort, and Vyasa associates this effort with enthusiasm and vigor. Vyasa also uses the term sadhana, which typically refers to one's specific daily spiritual practices. In the context of classical yoga, Vaikaspati Misra understands the sadhana to be the 8 limbs of yoga that will be discussed in chapters 2 and 3. So the vittas of the mind can be restrained when one is enthusiastic, vigorous, and steadfast in the practice of these 8 steps. The commentators reiterate that one can only hope to be concentrated or one-pointed. The mind can only flow peacefully when its rajasic and tamasic potential have been stilled. Practice is the effort involved in attaining this end. Ramananda Sarasvati introduces the next sutra by wondering how practice can ever achieve steadfastness, since it is constantly disturbed by rajasic and tamasic saskaras, distracting memories, and tendencies inherited from time immemorial, a question with which aspiring yogis can surely relate. 14 SA2 Durga, Kala, Nirantarya, Satkara Sevito Da, Vidmaisa, it practice, 2. But, Durga, prolonged, Kala, period of time, Nirantarya, uninterruptedly, Satkara, reverence, Sevita, attended to, cultivated, practiced, Da, firm, Vidmai, ground practice becomes firmly established when it has been cultivated uninterruptedly and with devotion over a prolonged period of time. Patanjali here gives further specifics pertaining to what the effort underpinning practice consists of. First, in order to become unshakable, practice must be performed nirantarya, without interruption. One cannot take breaks from one's practice whenever one feels like it or the mind dictates and expect to attain the goal of yoga, which is precisely to quell such whimsical vittas. Second, one's practice must continue Durga, Kala, for a long time. One cannot attain success in a few months or even after many years of practice unless one is exceptionally dedicated. Indeed, the Gita speaks of the yogi maintaining the yatna, effort, of the last sutra, for many births. Through effort and restraint, cleansed of all impurities, the yogi who has cultivated perfection over several lives, eventually attains the supreme destination. 6. 45. Practice is at the very least a lifelong commitment, to be undertaken. Patanjali goes on to say, Satkara, Sevita, with respect and devotion. One is, after all, pursuing the ultimate goal of life, realization of the innermost self, and cannot expect to attain this in a half-hearted or frivolous fashion, or in a random manner. Vyasa states that the practice of yoga becomes successful, that is, firmly established, when accompanied by austerity, celibacy, knowledge, and faith. Under these conditions, it is not immediately overwhelmed by the ingrained habits of the mind. Vaikaspati Misra calls these habits, which are saskaras that impel the mind outward into the sensual realm, highway robbers. He acknowledges that the sattvic nature of the mind, tranquility and calmness, is often overcome by rajas and tamas, but if one maintains one's practice, then eventually the mind becomes steadfast and concentrated. If one gives up one's practice, however, one's mind immediately becomes overwhelmed again. Hence this verse indicates that the practice of yoga has to be cultivated uninterruptedly and with devotion for a long period of time. If we correlate Siddha with a garden, Sattva with a beautiful bed of fragrant and attractive flowers, and Rajas and Tamas with weeds and pests, then we have a useful metaphor for the practice of yoga. As any gardener knows, maintaining a garden takes devotion and uninterrupted weeding and pest control for a prolonged period of time. In fact, these processes can never be interrupted, since within a remarkably short period of time, even the most devotedly cultivated garden becomes overwhelmed by weeds and pests. If left unattended, all one's hard work is easily undone. Likewise with yoga, the cultivation of sattva takes constant attention and cultivation. The minute the yogi relaxes his or her practices and vigilance, Vaikaspati Misra's highway robbers of Rajasic and Tamasic Saskras overwhelm the sattvic qualities so arduously developed. This is because, like weeds, Saskras are never actually eliminated or destroyed. They remain in a latent subconscious state and thus can become activated at any moment, unless constantly curtailed, although, as will be discussed below, they can be burned by certain practices, rendering them inoperable, hence Patanjali's notion of devoted uninterruptedness over a prolonged period. As an aside, many Hindu gurus and yogis have been embroiled in scandals that have brought disrepute to the transplantation of yoga and other Indic spiritual systems to the West. This sutra provides a mechanism of interpreting such occurrences. If one reads the early hagiographies of many Hindu gurus whose integrity was later found compromised, one is struck by the intensity, devotedness, and accomplishments of their initial practices. Nonetheless, however accomplished a yogi may become, if he or she abandons the practices of yoga under the notion of being enlightened or of having arrived at a point beyond the need of practice, it may be only a matter of time before past saskras, including those of past sensual indulgences, now unimpeded by practice, begin to surface. The result is scandal and traumatized disciples. There is no flower bed, however perfected, that can counteract the relentless emergence of weeds if left unattended. As Patanjali will discuss later in the text, as long as one is embodied, saskras remain latent, and therefore potential, in the Siddha. Hence one can read the sutra as indicating that since the practices of yoga must be uninterrupted, one would be wise to politely avoid yogis or gurus who claim to have attained a state of enlightenment such that they have transcended the need for the practice and renunciation prescribed by Patanjali here. 15d Niravika, Vyaya, Vitajya Vasakara, Saj Varagyamda, visible, perceptible, Anus Ravika, heard about from Vedic scriptural revelation, Vyaya, sensual objects, Vitajya, from one who is freed from craving, Vasakara, subdue, exert control, Saj, consciousness, Varagyam, renunciation, dispassion. Dispassion is the controlled consciousness of one who is without craving for sense objects, whether these are actually perceived, or described in scripture. After defining practice, Patanjali turns to the second element in the restraint of the mind, Varagyam, dispassion, renunciation. He defines dispassion as the absence of craving for sense objects. Objects, Vyaya. As examples of sense objects, Vyasa mentions members of the opposite sex, food, drink, and power. He notes that such dispassion or detachment precludes the inclination either to accept or reject such objects, even when they are available. That renunciation involves disinterest toward indulging in sense objects is straightforward, but Vyasa's observation that it also involves disinterest to overly rejecting them merits attention. Too much energy and fanfare dedicated to overly rejecting sense objects can often indicate a hidden attachment to those very objects that is being overcompensated for. Real detachment is indifference to sense objects whether in their absence or presence. As Vaikaspati Misra points out, one might be free from desires for objects because one knows nothing about them, but this does not qualify as dispassion. Dispassion is indifference to objects even when these are available. Vasakara means to have control over, thus Bhojaraja states. With regard to desires, I am not in their control, they are in my control. With 2:33 to 34 in mind, Vyasa states that one who is renounced understands the defects of sensuality from reflection on its consequences, or, as Vijnabhiku puts it, renunciation arises specifically from perceiving the defects of indulging in the objects of the senses, in other words, from discrimination. This is significant. The tradition does not take the position that sensual desires somehow disappear. Desires are imprints of past pleasurable experiences that are recorded in the Siddha as saskras. Saskras never disappear, they always remain latent, except in the exceptional cases when they are burnt by yogic practice. When they reactivate, they create desires, the impulse to create the pleasurable experience. The desire to avoid unpleasant experiences works along parallel lines. As Vaikaspati Misra notes, the power of renunciation comes not from being free from desires but from being indifferent to them. The discriminating yogi cultivates this indifference by recognizing that any sensual gratification, irrespective of how pleasurable, is temporary. Sooner or later, one is separated from the object of gratification and consequently experiences frustration. Through discrimination, one recognizes this inherent defect of sensual indulgence. One is also astute enough to realize realistically that there is always a karmic price to pay for the pursuit of pleasure. All actions, good or bad, when based on seeking gratification, generate correspondingly good or bad reactions and thus perpetuate sasra. Simply put, renunciation consists in the idea of enough of this sense gratification, says Vijnabhiku. 86 One becomes exhausted with the unending pursuit of seeking fulfillment in this way but attaining only temporary and unfulfilling, from an ultimate perspective, pleasures. Therefore, the wise strive for detachment and the eternal experience of the soul rather than the never-ending pursuit of ephemeral pleasure. This is a recurring theme in the Gita. Detached from the external contact of the senses with their objects, a person finds happiness in the Atman. Such a person, engaged in practicing the yoga of Brahman, the absolute truth, experiences eternal happiness. Material pleasures are born from the contact of the senses with the sense objects. They have a beginning and an end, and so they are the source of unhappiness. The wise do not delight in them. V. 21-22, however, Vijnabhiku also cautions that renunciation in and of itself does not guarantee success in yoga, and mentions the case of the sage Saubhari. The Bhagavata-pura, 9. 6.40 ff, tells the story of a sage whose desire for renunciation was so intense that he resolved to meditate under water so as to eliminate all the distractions of the sensual temptations of the world. However, he happened to open his eyes one day and noticed two fish mating. This activated latent erotic saskras in his own mind, perhaps from experiences recorded from previous births, and he again became overwhelmed with fantasies of sexual enjoyment, abandoned his meditation, and returned to worldly life. As noted, in normal circumstances, saskras are not destroyed, they remain latent until suitable conditions arise for reactivation. Therefore, excessive renunciation in and of itself does not necessarily guarantee that one is freed from the potential re-emergence of undesirable saskras. Vijnabhiku outlines various stages of detachment. One begins by making an effort to break attachment. Next, one determines that detachment has been accomplished towards certain objects, while others still need some work, and then, when detachment from all the external objects of the senses has been achieved, one begins to target internal attachments. These include such things as the attachment to honor and respect, and the opposite, the dislike of dishonor and disrespect. One may be externally very renounced and austere but internally be very attached to the prestige renunciation can bring, for example, the reputation of being a great yogi, or of having many followers. In this way, one slowly starves the karmasaya, the storehouse of karma discussed in 2:12, by giving up all desires for the fruits of actions, thereby preventing the further planting of karmic seeds. The commentators elaborate on Patanjali's comment here that there are two types of sense objects. There are the those seen in this world, the everyday sensual pleasures of life, and those that are not seen here but are anus rabbica, heard about, anu plus sru equals to hear from authorities. This is a reference to Vedic texts, 87 more commonly referred to as Sriti, from the same root. Texts that are transmitted and recited orally, and thus heard, and therefore is an indirect reference to the pleasures of the celestial realms referred to in these texts. Vyasa states that detachment requires that one be indifferent also to the heavenly enticements described in the Vedas and such texts, as well as attainments from yoga practice such as those outlined in the next verse, and the mystic powers outlined in chapter 3. The celestial realms mentioned in various Sanskrit literature as early as the Vedic hymns, but more elaborately in the Puras, point to other worlds or dimensions within the material universe where the level of enjoyment, duration of lifespan, and quality of experience far exceed anything available in this world. These worlds are the destination of the pious, that is, the good karma accrued by the performance of dharma, socio-religious duty, can translate into sojourns in these celestial realms. By the later Upanishadic period, however, these realms were perceived to have a defect in that they, too, involve embodied existence within the confines of sasra. They are not the ultimate or permanent destination of the soul. When the good karma, or righteous deeds, of the pious that earned them a place in these realms has expired, such souls return again to this world. Good karma is accumulated like money in the bank. When one starts to draw on one's credit, however much one has accumulated, sooner or later the account will be depleted. Likewise, upon attaining the celestial realms as a result of the accumulation of merit while on earth, souls are able to remain there until their karmic bank account is inevitably depleted, at which point they again return to this world where suffering is much more pronounced. In this sutra, Patanjali is implicitly criticizing aspects of Vedic ritualism, which, while on the decline due to the rise of the ascetic traditions including Buddhism and the great theistic devotional traditions of Vaishnavism and Saivism, would still have been a mainstream religious presence in his day. One of the expressed goals of Vedic ritualism is the obtainment of the good things in life in this world, followed by the pleasures of the celestial realms in the next. 88. The Vedic hymns often express a lusty desire for very earthly boons such as cows, offspring, victory over enemies, etc., which the sacrificer in the earlier Vedic period attempted to obtain by cajoling the gods who controlled such things, and, in the Middle Vedic period, by mastering the technology of ritual such that the gods were constrained to bestow these boons. 89. One can read the entire religious and philosophical history of post-Vedic India as a rejection of Vedic ritualism by communities that were eventually to become heterodox to the Vedic matrix, the Buddhists and Jains, and as a demotion or radical reinterpretation of it by those, such as Patanjali and the Yoga school, who remained in the orthodox Vedic fold. Among this latter category, a sometimes quite scathing critique of the ritualistic mind set can be found in texts as early as the Muaka Upanishad, a late Vedic text. The fools, who proclaim the Vedic sacrifices as the ultimate, return again to old age and death. Wallowing in ignorance, but imagining themselves wise and thinking themselves learned, the fools go about harming themselves, like blind men led by a man who is himself blind. Wallowing in ignorance again and again, these foolish people imagine, we have attained our goals. Because of their desires, these ritualists do not have foresight, therefore they fall back down, wretched and despondent, when their time in the celestial realms expires. Deeming sacrifices and gifts to the ritual priests as the highest, these idiots know nothing better. When they have enjoyed their pious work, eat the fruits of their karma in the celestial realms, they return again to this miserable world. But those seekers of the self in the forest, peaceful and wise, who practice austerity and faith, as they wander around as mendicants, pass through the doorway of the sun, spotless, to where that immortal Purua is, the eternal Atman. 7-11, the Upanishadic/yogic view, expressed in this early context, is that pleasures in this world or the next are temporary and simply entwine one in the cycle of birth and death. The Gita, too, is forceful in its rejection of Vedic ritualism in language that parallels that of the yoga commentarial tradition. Those who are ignorant subscribe to the flowery words of the Veda, Arjuna. Reveling in the Vedic rites, they proclaim there is nothing else but this. Their hearts filled with desires. Intent on the celestial realms, they take to the path of performing numerous variegated rites, which are dedicated to the attainment of opulence and sensual enjoyment, but which bestow rebirth as the fruit of action. To such people, attached to sensual enjoyment and opulence, whose minds have been stolen by these flowery words, a mind fixed in samadhi is not granted. 2. 42-44, Patanjali's reference to disinterest in anus ravika, vyaya, the sense objects available from Vedic ritualism, falls in this same vein. Clearly the goals of yoga are in complete contrast to the lusty goals of the normative Vedic sacrificial cult that was still a mainstream presence in his day. Therefore, disinterest in this type of ritualism, whether Vedic or other, is a prerequisite to yoga. Essentially, the critique here is one of materialistic religiosity performed with the motive of enjoying the good things of the world. This criticism is thus perennially relevant to the attitudes underpinning religious traditions other than Hindu ones, which likewise promote worldly boons as the goal of religious practice. In other words, connecting this verse to modes of religiosity on our own horizons, engaging in religious activities with material motives for mundane goals conflicts with the transcendent goals of yoga. In sum, renunciation means not only disinterest in the visible things of this world but also disinterest in some of the worldly or celestial boons that might be promoted in sacred scripture itself. One more comment is in order here. A general principle of Sanskrit hermeneutics is that a first item mentioned on a list carries more importance than any subsequent items. Thus, of the 5 vittas, prama, right knowledge, is listed first. It is the most important state of mind. And even within the 3 subdivisions of prama, the yoga school prioritizes pratyaka, direct experience, hence this is situated as the first item of the prama sublist. Of the 2 ingredients of niraya, then, by this principle, abhyasa is situated before vairagya, since, by practice, the by-products of dispassion, detachment, and renunciation arise spontaneously. It is therefore generally a precondition of the latter. 16 tad, parapurua, kyatirgva, vatyam tad, that renunciation, para, higher, purua, the soul, self, innermost consciousness, kit, knowledge, perception, gva, qualities of sattva, rajas, and tamas, vatyam, indifference higher than renunciation is indifference to the gvas themselves. This stems from perception of the purua, soul. There are 2 levels of renunciation or detachment, indifference toward the sensual objects of the world or of the celestial realms, as outlined in the last sutra, and a higher level of detachment stemming from indifference to the very gvas themselves, gvavatyam. We should bear in mind that the gvas of prakrti are the subtle stuff from which all objects are made, whether physical or mental, sense matter, mind, and everything else in existence except for the purua, pure consciousness itself, or evolutes from prakrti when it is stirred by the gvas inherent in her. So indifference toward the gvas automatically includes indifference to all praktic objects external to pure consciousness. Vyasa states that this higher and ultimate level of dispassion or renunciation referred to here stems from purua, khyati, awareness of purua itself. Complete loss of interest in all things material can realistically take place only when the yogi has attained something far superior. Vaikaspati Misra reiterates the metaphysics underpinning this notion. First, when the influences of rajas and tamas have been eliminated, the mind's natural quality of sattva can manifest without disturbance. Sattva, in addition to producing a sustainable experience of happiness, unlike the fleeting pleasures of the senses, is by nature pure, transparent, luminous, and insightful. With no disturbing influences, sattva is maximized, and the inherent lucidity of the mind can manifest. Tamas and rajas taint the mind, which is filtering consciousness, distracting it from its source, the Purua soul, and out into the realm of sense objects. When these two gunas are stilled, the mind's natural lucidity of sattva allows it to peacefully and blissfully contemplate the distinction between the gunas and their products, which include the mind itself, and the pure Purua soul. Thus, this natural discriminative knowledge of the difference between Purua and the gunas, that is, Purua and Prakti, referred to in the sutra by Patanjali, is the highest and ultimate function that the sattvic siddha can perform and manifests when other types of knowledge have faded away. Vaikaspati Misra adds, though, that ultimately the yogi must transcend even attachment to this sattvic recognition of the distinction between the gunas and Purua. Vijanabhiku elaborates that the yogi must attain the state where the realization occurs that even discriminative knowledge of the distinction between the gunas and Purua is a function of the Praktic siddha, it is not a function of Purua. Besides, even elevated and ultimate knowledge can be transitory and therefore defective. After all, pure sattva is nonetheless a guna and therefore unstable by nature, since the three gunas are always in flux. Therefore, upon attaining the highest awareness of Purua's own nature, the pure mind checks and restrains itself, and hence Purua's awareness becomes disassociated from all types of knowledge whatsoever. This, says Vijanabhiku, is called the highest dispassion by Patanjali because it is dispassion toward the most subtle aspects of matter, the very gunas themselves, whereas the renunciation in the previous sutra primarily refers to the grosser aspects of matter, the gunas as manifest in their most physical and solid products, the gross sense objects, or subtler internal thoughts. Vijanabhiku mentions Jayavarata from the Bhagavata Pura as an exemplar of Vairagya. 90 Jayavarata had been an advanced yogi in a previous life but, due to attachment to a deer, had failed to attain the ultimate goals of yoga. See 3.7 for the details. Consequently, upon being reborn, although internally his mind was completely immersed in thought of Lord Vayu, he presented himself to the world as being insane, stupid, blind, and deaf, so as never again to become attached to anything material. Although his pious and well-meaning father tried to teach him the duties of a Brahmat, the scholarly and priestly caste of Vedic India, Jayavarata refused to engage with the world in any way at all. Such was his disregard for anything made of the gunas, to use Patanjali's terminology in the sutra. He simply wandered around barefoot and clad in filthy rags like a precious jewel covered by dirt. 91 Slept on the ground, neglected his personal cleanliness, and subsisted on broken rice, husks, worm-eaten grains, and the discarded rice left sticking on the bottom of pots. Since he was nonetheless stout in limb, some worshippers of Kali eventually seized him and brought him unresisting to the goddess to be offered as a human sacrifice. But the goddess burst forth from the deity and decapitated her own devotees so as to save this enlightened yogi. In short, Jayavarata is an exemplar in popular narrative of the complete renunciation indicated by Patanjali in the sutra. Vyasa states that the yogi who has attained the state of Vairagya can now think, whatever was to be achieved has been achieved, the obstacles to the path that were to be destroyed have been destroyed, and the cycle of repeated existence, one who is born, dies, and one who dies is reborn, has been broken. 92 Vaikaspati Misra reiterates that the links holding this cycle together are the myriad individual acts of virtue and vice, karma. As discussed, karma means action, the performance of any type of act, and since every action performed generates a reaction, and one acts at every moment, the cycle of action and reaction is potentially eternal. Vaikaspati Misra draws attention to 2:12-13. Which states that this reservoir of karma has its roots in nescience, mistaking the pure eternal self to be a product of the impure non-eternal products of the gunas. It fructifies only if this root exists. Thus, through the discrimination and knowledge ensuing from the dispassion, renunciation, and desirelessness discussed in these two sutras, nescience, the root of karma and thus of sasra, the cycle of birth and death, is destroyed. Vaikaspati Misra states that the yogi whose intellect is saturated with this recognition of the distinction between the guas and purua is said to be situated in the samadhi state of 429 known as Dharmamika, the cloud of virtue. This sutra concludes Patanjali's definition of yoga given in I. 2. Siddha, Vitti, Nara, Sutras I. 5-12 discuss the Vittas, and I. 13-16, Nara. The only analysis Patanjali has not undertaken is a definition of Siddha. One might suppose that he did not feel the need to do so because the word was so well known at the time. This is regrettable because the term is actually used somewhat differently in different philosophical contexts. In Vedanta, for example, it is perceived as a fourth aspect of the internal organ, in addition to buddhi, ahakra, and manas, and corresponds to memory. See Akara's commentary. To Vedanta Sutras 2. 4.6, and Yoga, Visiha 3. 96.55, as it does in a reference in the Mahabharata, 12. 27,493, and in the Bhagavata Pura, 3. 26.14. Considering his overall remarkably systematic treatment of his subject matter, it is puzzling that Patanjali did not provide a definition of Siddha, the most important term in the entire system. However, given that other than for its latent function as reservoir of saskras, the Karmasaya of 2.12, the Siddha is essentially known only through its Vittas, that is, anything the Siddha does or can do manifests as one of the Vittas, then one might surmise that by carefully analyzing the Vittas, Patanjali has, in effect, analyzed and described the Siddha itself. Some comments to this effect or otherwise would have been welcome, nonetheless. I. 17 Vitarka, Vikaranandasmita, Rupanugamat Samprajta Vitarka, absorption with physical awareness, Vikara, absorption with subtle awareness, Ananda, absorption with bliss, Asmita, absorption with the sense of I-ness, Rupa, form, Anugamat, accompanied by Samprajta, a type of samadhi state which still uses the mind and an object of meditation. Samprajanata Samadhi consists of the consecutive mental stages of absorption with physical awareness, absorption with subtle awareness, absorption with bliss, and absorption with the sense of I-ness. Having discussed yoga in general as the cessation of all thought, Patanjali here and in the next verse turns his attention to two basic categories of samadhi, the state of consciousness ensuing when all thought has, in fact, been stilled, and therefore the final goal of yoga, Samprajanata and Asamprajanata samadhis. This sutra addresses the former category. In instances such as this, English translations such as absorption with physical awareness for Vitarka and absorption with subtle awareness for Vikara do not convey the sense or meaning or difference between these two levels of samadhi. The technical way that these Sanskrit terms are being used here cannot be captured by a suitable English equivalent, so the reader is advised not to try to understand these terms through the clumsy English words a translator chooses to convey them. In fact, even the Sanskrit terms are an artificiality, as Vijayanabhika points out, and not to be correlated with how they are used in other contexts, that is, their conventional Sanskrit dictionary meanings, c. e.g. 2.34 for a different usage of the term Vitarka, and 2.3 for Asmita. So, since these English terms are little better than heuristic indicators, the Sanskrit terms will be retained in the ensuing discussion. This sutra initiates the esoteric teachings of yoga. That this sutra is so succinct yet understood as encapsulating a universe of esoteric significance points to the nature of the sutras, aptly expressed by Feuerstein, as originally and primarily maps for meditative introspection, intended to guide the yogin in his exploration of the terra incognita of the mind. Thus these models served a very practical psychological purpose. This hypothesis helps to explain why so many of these models, in early texts, are without apparent logical coherence. These maps are records of internal experiences rather than purely theoretical constructions. They are descriptive rather than explanatory. The map character of the ontogenetic model of classical yoga is beyond question. 1980, 117. As the symbols of a map denote far greater entities than might be evident from the simple signs themselves, circles, squares, triangles, etc. And alert the traveler to what to expect on the road ahead, so the technical terms in the sutra represent altered states of consciousness far beyond those of conventional awareness, and thus beyond the ability of conventional words or labels to describe. They are guides for the yogi, alerting him or her to some of the meditative experiences that will be encountered on the path. Vyasa is curiously not very detailed in his explanation of this complex sutra at this point, but these stages of samadhi are discussed in more depth in I. 40-45. He notes that these are 4 stages of samprajanata, samadhi, all of which have an alambana, a support, see discussion in I. 10. He means by this that the consciousness of the Purua is still flowing through the Pratik Siddha to connect with or be supported by an object of meditational focus, albeit in progressively more subtle ways. In this state, the mind is fixed on one pratyaya, discussed in I. 10, or undeviating vitti, that of the object of concentration, and resists all change into other states. The object of concentration, whatever it might be, is the alambana, the unwavering image the object produces on the concentrated mind, the pratyaya. It is Vaikaspati Misra who unpacks the sutra in detail. He considers the first state on Patanjali's list, Vitarka, samadhi, to be contemplation on a gross physical object, that is to say, meditating on an object that one experiences as a manifestation or construct of the gross physical or material elements. It is thus the first level of experiencing an object in samadhi. Keeping the metaphysics of skya in mind, we know that the 5 gross elements that constitute gross physical objects evolve from elements that are more subtle, that is, they are actually evolutes from the 10 matras, the 5 subtle elements. Vaikaspati Misra states that Vikara Samadhi, the second level of samadhi concentration mentioned by Patanjali in the sutra, involves absorption on this more subtle aspect of the object of meditation, perceiving the object as actually consisting of these more subtle ingredients. In fact, I. 44 informs us that the subtle substructure of external reality can refer to any of the evolutes from Prakti, as even the 10 matras evolved from Ahakra, which, in turn, evolves from Buddhi. Thus, the latter can also be considered skma, subtle. As a new archer first aims at large objects, Vaikaspati Misra says, and then progressively smaller ones, so the neophyte yogi first experiences the gross nature of the object in meditation and then its progressively more subtle nature. Instead of experiencing the object as composed of compact quantum masses, the buddhidai gross elements, as in the first state of Vitarka, in Vikara, the yogi experiences the object as composed of vibratory, radiant potential, subtle energy, a sublevel of reality normally imperceptible to the senses. 94. Vijnabhiku gives us a theistic example of these 2 states of samadhi. If one wishes to fix the mind on God, Isvara, as Patanjali will encourage in I. 23-29, how does one do so? Isvara is also a type of Purua, I. 23, and thus beyond Prakti, and we know that the Pratik mind cannot fix itself on something more subtle than and metaphysically distinct from itself. Vijnabhiku speaks of fixing the mind on a divine form of Isvara such as that of Vayu. Essentially, this can only entail fixing the mind on some saskra connected with God, some image, perhaps from one's temple or favorite artistic rendition. When this entails concentrating on Isvara in the form of a saskra of some gross Pratik form, such as a deity, it is Vitarka, and when in a more subtle Pratik form, such as God's characteristics, it is Vikara. We will see that, for Vijnabhiku, as for most of the Bhakti traditions, this theistic meditation will eventually culminate in direct, non-Pratik perception of Isvara as Purua, that is, a non Pairctic supreme being of pure consciousness. Patanjali has not discussed this particular type of practice. He will recommend fixing the mind on Isvara in the form of O in I. 27 to 28, but Vijnabhiku's approach is certainly acceptable within the framework of this system, and most of the commentators do refer to such conventional bhakti modes of Isvara, centered meditation. Whatever the object of meditation, the sine qua non at this point is undeviated concentration on it. In the state of samadhi, the mind is fixed so intensely on its alambana that it essentially merges with it, like, says Vijnabhiku, fire in a red, hot iron ball. There is no consensus among the commentators as to the exact nature of the last two stages of samadhi, ananda and asmita, underscoring the fact that such states do not lend themselves to scholastic categorization and analysis. 95 Vaikaspati Misra's version perhaps surfaces most commonly and seems predicated on the information we will encounter later in the chapter. Specifically, with an eye on I. 41, he utilizes the three components of knowledge identified in Hindu philosophical discourse to demarcate the differences among these four stages of samadhi. In any act of knowledge, there is the knower or subject of knowledge, the instruments of knowledge, mind and senses, etc. And the object of knowledge. These are termed gid, griha, and grahaya, respectively, literally, the grasper, the instrument of grasping, and that which is grasped. For Vaikaspati Misra, in the first two stages of samadhi outlined above, Vitarka and Vikara, the object on which the mind is fixed, whether perceived as its grosser outer form or subtler inner constituents, is nonetheless an external object and therefore considered grahaya, that which is grasped. Now, in the third stage, ananda, samadhi, the yogi transfers awareness from the objects of the senses, grahaya, to the organs of the senses themselves, graha, the instruments of grasping. He specifies that these are the powers, sakti, behind the sensual abilities of seeing, touching, smelling, tasting, and hearing, rather than the gross physical organs of eye, ear, nose, etc. The citizen now becomes aware of the mechanisms of cognition, the instruments of the senses. In other words, it becomes aware of the internal organ through which external objects are grasped, rather than the external objects themselves, whether experienced in their gross or subtle constitutions. Since, in Skya, the graha includes the internal organs, manas, buddhi, and ahakara, which comprise the siddha in yoga, Bhojaraja understands the support of the mind in ananda, samadhi to be the siddha itself, specifically in its aspect as ahakara, thus differing somewhat with Vaikaspati Misra, who correlates ahakara with the next stage. Thus in this perspective, in this third stage, awareness becomes aware of the siddha itself in its capacity of acquiring knowledge, as an instrument that grasps the objects of the senses. In other words, the mind focuses on its own cognizing nature. Since the gua of sattva predominates in ahakara and buddhi, although, as Bhojaraja notes, traces of rajas and tamas are still present at this stage, which for him demarcates this level of samadhi from the fourth, and sattva is the source of bliss, Patanjali calls this stage ananda, samadhi, blissful absorption. This is because it involves experiencing a much more rarefied, purer, and more sustainable, and thus supernormal, form of sattvic bliss. Gita 14:6 warns, however, of becoming attached to this sattvic happiness, and so there is a danger at this stage that the yogi may mistake this sense of bliss and unprecedented insight with the ultimate goal of yoga. In other words, there is a danger that the yogi or mystic will mistake this rapturous state of supernormal perception for the ultimate experience of Purua, or for Vedantins, of Atmananda, the bliss of the self. Vijnabhiku is uncharacteristically vague about this third stage of ananda, samadhi, although he explicitly disagrees with Vaikaspati Misra that it is supported by the sense organs. He states that in ananda, samadhi, the mind transcends the previous stage and experiences bliss due to an increase of sattva, but he does not specify the location of this bliss. He merely notes that at this point the object of meditation is no longer perceived as consisting of even the subtle elements, as was the case in the previous stage, but is experienced as pure sattvic bliss, about which all the commentators agree, understandably, given the name Patanjali assigns this third type of samadhi. Again, this is not the bliss inherent in Purua, inherent therein at least according to the Vedanta tradition, but also, as we will suggest in 2.5, arguably, to yoga as well, awareness is still flowing through the mind and focused on an external object, but by contacting the sattvic dimension of the object of meditation, the mind is simply aware of all, pervading happiness and is immersed in an ocean of bliss. Vijnabhika quotes Ka's description of this state in the Gita, a state which the text actually defines as yoga, when the yogi experiences that endless happiness, sukha, which is grasped by the discriminative faculty, buddhi, but beyond the grasp of the senses, he remains fixed in this state and never strays from the truth. This state, free from any trace of suffering, is called yoga. 6.21-23, Vijnabhika notwithstanding, the prevalent view seems to be that in the third state of samadhi, the mind becomes absorbed on some aspect of the instruments of cognition themselves, rather than supported by or concentrated on the gross or subtle constituents of an external object of the senses. All commentators at least agree that at this stage of ananda, samadhi, the mind becomes immersed in the sattva prevalent in this state of awareness. Finally, by involuting awareness further and penetrating the internal organ of meditation to its still more essential nature, one transcends even the instruments of knowledge and arrives at ahakra, if one follows Vaikaspati Misra, or Buddhi, if one follows Bhojaraja either way, to the closest Pirtic coverings to the Purua itself. Relentless in the pursuit of true and ultimate knowledge, at this point the yogi attains the fourth and final stage of Samprajanata, samadhi listed by Patanjali in the sutra, Usmita, samadhi. Now, following Bhojaraja's schema, having penetrated the constituents of the external object of meditation through its gross and subtle elements consecutively in the first two stages of samadhi, and having withdrawn itself from external cognition and into a state of contemplating the powers behind the very organs of cognition in the third, awareness penetrates the siddha further, absorbing itself in the siddha's feature of buddhi, the grahit, the grasper, the closest Pirtic covering to the Purua itself. Hariharananda states that awareness bypasses the feeling of bliss in the previous stage to contact the experiencer of bliss. Buddhi, in this highly sattvic state, is so pure and luminous it can reflect the consciousness of Purua back to itself. At this point, since it has already transcended all objects outside of itself, including the internal organs of cognition, Buddhi focuses inward, reflecting Purua itself as its object of meditation. Another way of putting this is that the yogi now finally becomes aware of Purua itself as pure consciousness by means of its reflection in Buddhi. In other words, the siddha of the yogi becomes indirectly aware of Purua, since this awareness is still mediated by Buddhi. Nonetheless, the yogi becomes aware of I am-ness, the etymological meaning of asmita, rather than any external material Pirtic object, or even internal organ of cognition. As my, I am, is the first person singular of the root as, to be, and ta is a suffix added to adjectives to denote ness, but Akara notes that this I am, ness, asmita, is not the same as the asmita listed as an obstacle to yoga in 2.3. Asmita in the context of the klesas in 2.2 and 7 involves a misidentification of Purua with what it is not and thus corresponds to ahakra. 96 Asmita as klesa involves an object of I am fat, I am sad, I am a male. The asmita in the context of samadhi occurs when the siddha contemplates the awareness of Purua by means of Purua's reflection in the pure mirror of the sattvic siddha. The mind now experiences an I am-ness in the sense of the true subject of awareness, the source of my awareness is Purua. Asmita is consciousness reflecting on the mirror of the mind, as a result of which the siddha gains a genuine absolute knowledge of the real source and identity of the consciousness pervading it. Whereas in the previous level the mind was aware that I am blissful, in this fourth level it is now simply experiencing a state of I am. This is pure I am-ness with no external object or specific content of self-identification, so it is very close to the goal of direct realization of Purua. This fourth stage is still within the realm of Prakti, however, still at a stage of Samprajanata, Samadhi. In other words, it is supported by some connection with Prakti, because the Siddha is still being used as an instrument to channel awareness, even though the object of awareness is now Purua itself rather than any external manifestation of Prakti. The Purua at this point is still not fully autonomous and extricated from its appropriation by the mind. Before proceeding, we must note that, as with his explanation of Ananda, Vijayanath also parts company with Bhojaraja and Vaikaspati Misra in his understanding of Asmita. For him, as a Vaishnava theist, this stage involves a direct vision of God, Isvara, 97 whom we will encounter in I. 23, below. Vijayanath claims that in the second stage of Savakara, Samadhi noted in the sutra, the yogi fixes the mind on the characteristics, sopati, of God. Essentially, this can only entail fixing the mind on some sastra connected with God. But this fourth stage of Asmita, Samadhi for him entails transcending this gross, praktic, level of meditation of the previous stages and having a direct experience of Isvara as a conscious being. This notion that the Purua can have a transcendent personal vision of a divine form of God is standard in the Hindu theistic traditions. As the Yoga tradition has always been adamant that the Purua is an entity that can be directly perceived, so have the Bhakti devotional traditions always held that Isvara as Supreme Purua, Gita 14. 16-18, can likewise be personally perceived, for example, Gita 11. 54. Patanjali, however, gives no information pertaining to the experiential relationship between the liberated yogi and Isvara, but this does not discount Vijayanath's interpretation. However one takes the various levels of Samprajanata, Samadhi, one final step remains where this ultimate uncoupling of Purua from all connection with Prakti and involvement whatsoever with the Siddha occurs. This is Asamprajanata, Samadhi, Samadhi without support, and a prefix to any noun in Sanskrit negates that noun 98, which will be outlined in the next sutra. Also, the first two stages of Samadhi noted in the sutra, Vitarka and Vikara, will later, in I. 42, be further subdivided and refined into Savitarka and Nirvitarka and Savakara and Nirvikara, respectively. The prefix sa means with, and nir means without. This will therefore result in a total of 6 stages of Samprajanata, Samadhi, before the final stage of Asamprajanata, Samadhi. 99 therefore, including the latter, there will be a total of 7 stages of Samadhi explicitly expressed by Patanjali in his system. Vyasa notes that each progressively grosser level of Samadhi includes the others, just as the grosser aspects of matter include the subtler ones. Vitarka includes Vikara, Ananda, and Asmita, although obviously the latter have yet to be fully experienced by the yogi in their own right. Vikara includes Ananda and Asmita, and Ananda includes Asmita. Also, it is important to reiterate, along with Bhojaraja, that any type of Samadhi involves meditation on the chosen object to the exclusion of all other objects, irrespective of the level of meditation outlined in the sutra. In other words, the mind has attained Siddha, Viti, Nara, it is completely undeviating in focus, which is the prerequisite of all stages of Samadhi. Additionally, even as there are differences pertaining to the states of mind corresponding to these stages, the object that the mind uses as its support, that is, on which to fix itself, can, as Bhojaraja notes, be either any material object or evolut of Prakti, or Isvara, God, with Patanjali clearly prioritizing the latter. But, as Vijayanath in turn notes, the object must remain the same, whether it be the four-armed form of Vayu, or an ordinary object, such as an earthen pot. 100 Otherwise, if objects are whimsically changed, the yogi will be displaying fickleness of mind and thus be disqualified from this stage of samadhi. In conclusion, we have noted that there are minor differences among the commentators' understanding of the metaphysical nature of the two final types of samprajanata, samadhi ananda and asmita, but all commentators agree that in principle the sutra describes refining one's awareness during consecutive stages of meditation through progressively more subtle states of cognition in quest of the source of awareness itself, purua. Also, we can note that in the last two stages of samadhi, one cannot technically speaking know the grahat or grahit, because acts of knowing can take place only via these instruments of knowledge and the knowers themselves. Knowing cannot know the very instruments of knowledge any more than cooking can cook itself. Rather, awareness becomes aware of them. This consideration can help us better appreciate this relentless progression toward the source of awareness, from gross objects of knowledge to their subtle substrates, to the instruments of knowledge themselves, and, beyond again, to the ultimate praktic knower, until finally one arrives at purua itself. The relationship between the four stages of samadhi outlined here and the four dhyanas, dhyanas in Sanskrit, outlined in Buddhist meditation has long been noted. 101 dhyana occurs as the seventh of the 8 limbs of Patanjali's system, 3.2. But it is used in Buddhism and also in older Hindu texts such as the Gita and Mahabharata as a synonym for samadhi, the final stage. The Buddha speaks of attaining the first dhyana, which consisted of vitarka, vikara, and vivka, and then proceeding to attain the other 3 stages of dhyana, Majjhima Nikaya 246-47. There are several different lists of the 4 dhyana, samadhi, states in the Buddhist Abhidhamma schools, and the most important of these include vitarka and vikara, the first 2 items mentioned in the sutra under the first dhyana. 102 Moreover, ananda, the third item mentioned by Patanjali, or its correlate, sukha, is experienced in the first 3 of the 4 stages of dhyana. Only the final item from the sutra, asmita, I am, ness, does not have a clear parallel in Buddhism, hardly surprising given the Buddhist rejection of an autonomous purua. It is worth noting again in this regard Bhaidma's mention of the 4 dhyanas in the Hindu Mahabharata. Bhaidma too is clearly using the term as a synonym of samadhi. Bhaidma includes in his first stage of dhyana 3 features, vitarka, vikara, and vivka, thereby paralleling the Buddhist system. 103. O son of Thu, I will now explain to you the fourfold yoga of dhyana, meditation, knowing which the great seers of old attained eternal perfection. The yogis, great seers, blissful in knowledge, their minds set on nirvana, perform dhyana that has been well practiced. A sage should fix his mind so that it becomes one-pointed. He should withdraw all the senses from the sense objects. Then, being wise, he should merge his 5 senses into the mind and concentrate 104 his wandering mind and senses. When such a sage concentrates his mind on the first dhyana from the beginning, the meditative states of vikara, vitarka, and vivka manifest. Immersed in that bliss, yogis delight in the performance of dhyana and thereby attain nirvana, which is free from distress. 12. 188.1-22. Although the understanding of these terms differs, the yoga tradition's understanding tends to situate the psychological basis of these states within the more cosmological framework of skin metaphysics. 105. It is impossible not to recognize a common substratum of practice and terminology. Thus, it is important to be aware of the shared context of meditational practices in ancient India. Hindu, Buddhist, or Jain expressions in their formative periods were not as distinctly demarcated as they later became in scholastic literature. Whatever may have been the direction of influence, 106 the shared or interfertilizing context of meditation in ancient India is undeniable. 18 Virama, Pratyayabhyasa, Purva Saskra, Eona Virama, termination, cessation, Pratyaya, idea, notion, thought, abhyasa, practice. Purva, previous, saskra, mental imprints, memories, subconscious impressions, ea, remainder, enya, the other samadhi, asamprajanata, samadhi. The other samadhi, asamprajanata, samadhi is preceded by cultivating the determination to terminate all thoughts. In this state only latent impressions remain. In the last sutra, Patanjali discussed samprajanata, samadhi, which was subdivided into 4. Here he uses anya, the other, to refer to another state beyond this, which the commentators take to be asamprajanata, a term that actually never occurs in the sutras themselves. As we have seen, the 4 states of samprajanata all involve the citta in various ways. Asamprajanata is beyond the mind. It is therefore beyond thought and word. Perhaps to underscore this, Patanjali has used the simple pronoun anya rather than a descriptive term, thereby pointing to asamprajanata as a state that transcends all conceptualization, descriptive categories, and nomenclatures, which are all products of citta. In the same vein, the Mkha Upanishad calls it the 4th, beyond the other 3 states of consciousness, waking, dream, and deep sleep. The commentators present asamprajanata, samadhi without support, as being the state where the awareness of Purusha is no longer aware of any external entity at all, including the citta, since the latter has dissolved itself. This state corresponds with nirbija, without seed, I. 51. In this final and ultimate state, the supreme goal of yoga, the mind is not supported by any active thought, including even the object of meditation. Latent seeds, or saskras, will not sprout into active thoughts. The vittas of the mind exists simply as potential, and the saskras, the subconscious imprints that trigger thoughts, memories, and karma, are also latent. Since the mind is now empty of all thoughts, or, as Vyasa puts it, appears as if non-existent, the awareness of Purusha now no longer has any object whatsoever to be aware of, and thus, for the first time, can become only self-aware. 107. The final goal of yoga has been attained. Another way of considering this is that awareness is eternal, it cannot ever cease being aware. Following the Upanishads, the first spiritual teaching of the Gita in chapter 2 articulates this repeatedly. The soul is indestructible, it cannot be slain, it does not die when the body is slain, nor is it ever born, it is birthless, eternal, perpetual, original, it cannot be burnt, pierced by weapons, wetted, blown by the wind, it is unmanifest, beyond thought, unchanging, etc. 2. 17 ff. Awareness cannot be switched off like a light. That being the case, the soul's only options are what it is aware of. It can be object, aware, or, again, loosely speaking, subject, aware, that is, aware of entities or objects other than itself, or exclusively aware of itself as awareness with no reference to any other entity. After myriad births being aware of the unlimited varieties of praktic objects, Purusha has now come to the point of self-realization, realizing itself as distinct from not just objects of thought but the very faculty and process of thought itself, the citta and its vittas. When there are no objects to detain its awareness, Purusha has no alternative but to be self-aware. This is asamprajanata, samadhi. Now, there must be, in principle, some kind of final thought or mental activity before the mind enters the state of complete inactivity in the asamprajanata, samadhi. Patanjali states in the sutra that the last thought or cognitive act immediately before asamprajanata, samadhi is the thought of terminating thoughts, any thoughts, even the highest kinds, such as thoughts discriminating between Purusha and Prakti. This last thought is termed the virama, pratyaya in the sutra. Although this very notion of terminating all thoughts is itself a thought, Vyasa considers it a notion devoid of any objective phenomenon. One might say that it is the last mental state prior to final liberation, the terminator thought, so to speak. Vyasa states that this virama, pratyaya, is born of the dispassion discussed in I. 16. By the constant mental cultivation of the notion of ceasing all thought, Says Vyasa, the mind is deprived of any other object of thought and becomes without support, that is, with nothing to sustain it. It becomes completely empty, all its saskras remain latent, saskra-ye, as Patanjali points out here. Bhojaraja states that at this stage the mind constantly dwells on this sole notion of terminating thought and rejects all other vitas. This type of mental cultivation is the penultimate stage of yoga and immediately precedes asamprajanata, samadhi. Akara compares this virama, pratyaya, terminator thought, to an ebbing flame, which is still nonetheless a flame, until all its fuel expires and it is turned to dust, a latent saskra. Thus, when even this notion of terminating all thought ceases, asamprajanata, samadhi ensues. Al. Biruni compares the embodied soul to a grain of rice with its husk. As long as the grain retains the husk, the active siddha with its saskras, it has the potential for sprouting and ripening. When the husk is removed, this potential ceases. 108. I. 19 Bhava, Pratyayo Videha, Prakti, Layanam Bhava, becoming, material existence, birth, Pratyaya, idea, cause, 109 Videha, unembodied, without a gross body, Prakti, Layanam, of those entities merged in matter. For some, those who are unembodied and those who are merged in matter, the state of samprajanata is characterized by absorption in subtle states of prakti. Although Vyasa and most of the other commentators understand this abstruse sutra as following the topic of Sutra 18 and thus pointing to a type of asamprajanata, samadhi where only latent saskras remain in the mind, this seems impossible, given the nature of the states described in this sutra. We thus agree with Bhojaraja that this sutra continues from I. 17, elaborating on certain yogis whose minds are still absorbed in some state of prakti paralleling the Pirktic attainments outlined there. The asamprajanata, samadhi of I. 18 involves uncouplement from prakti and thus cannot refer to the Pirktic states attained by the kind of practitioners referred to in this sutra. The type of quasi-samadhi indicated here is still connected with bhava, literally, becoming, which I have translated as states of prakti, and points to a state that can also be attained by those other than practitioners of real yoga. The beings in this category remain absorbed in various subtle dimensions of prakti and thus stranded, as it were, at various heights of supernormal attainments accrued from the yoga path. Thus Bhojaraja considers the states indicated in the sutra to point to semblances of yoga. Patanjali here refers to two categories of such beings, the videhas, those who are unembodied, and the prakti, layas, those who are merged in matter. Their common denominator is that these entities still maintain notions of self, identity that are connected with material, Pirktic, existence. The commentators hold that these categories refer to two types of quasi-perfected yogis who do not have gross physical bodies but exist on some other level within prakti. Prakti, as has been discussed, evolves into a number of evoludes, buddhi, intelligence, ahakara, ego, manas, the mind, and the 10 matras subtle elements, mahabhuta gross elements, and organs of action. None of these levels represents the real self, purua. They are all subtler or grosser evoludes from inanimate matter that cover the purua in various layers. But just as normal people misidentify the self with the gross physical body, there are higher beings who, through some type of practice, have managed to transcend the grosser levels of self, misidentification, but who nonetheless remain stranded at more subtle levels of misidentification. They remain in these states of pseudo-liberation until their latent saskras activate once more, at which time they return again to grosser levels of sasra. More specifically, Vyasa and Vaikaspati Misra identify the first category of beings mentioned by Patanjali, the Videhas, as the celestial beings. 110 Akara specifies that the celestial beings referred to here are only those engaged in the path of yoga, and Vijanabhika says that these are the higher, level celestials that do not have gross physical bodies but bodies made out of buddhi, pure intelligence. Some categories of celestials are nourished by subtle forms of prakti instead of gross food, some even subsisting on the inside of buddhi, the subtlest form of prakti. 111 The Puras indicate that there are different categories of gods, who become progressively superior in terms of lifespan, powers, sensual facilities, and insight, in the celestial realm called Satyaloka. For example, the celestials have surpassed all the realizations that are encompassed in Samprajanata, Samadhi, S. Bhattacharya, 1968. The commentators hold the second category mentioned by Patanjali in the sutra, those merged in prakti, matter, to refer to entities who consider themselves to be either unmanifest, primordial prakti herself, or buddhi, the first evolute from prakti, or the second evolute ahakra, or even the 10 matras, 5 subtle elements. In other words, more or less anyone who does not identify himself or herself as being the gross material body made of the 5 gross elements, but still identifies the self as being some other, more subtle, aspect of prakti, could be considered prakti, laya, merged in matter. In this they follow the Skyakarika, XLV, where the state of prakti, laya in question is held to come from vairagya, non-attachment, I. 15. In his commentary to this verse in the Skyakarika, Gaupta states, one might have vairagya but without knowing the 24 evolutes of prakti. This state, which is founded on ignorance, is prakti, layanam. At death, such a person is not liberated, but is merged into the 8 evolutes of prakti pradhana, 112 intelligence, ego, and the 5 subtle elements. From there, he returns again to sasra. 113 However, one merged in this state thinks I am liberated. This is a type of ignorance. 114 Vaikaspati Misra takes Bhava 115 in the sutra as a reference to avidya, ignorance, thus these two categories of yogis are still immersed in ignorance, mistaking the self with the non-self. Vijanabhiku, on the other hand, takes Bhava to mean birth, perhaps in resonance with Patanjali's comment in 4.1 of birth as being a cause of yogic attainment, and holds that the two types of yogis mentioned here have attained their respective states due to their births, or practices performed in a past life. The celestials certainly fall into this category. Bhojaraja takes Bhava to refer to Sasra. He considers the Videhas of the sutra to be those who have attained the state Ananda, Samadhi, and Prakti, Layas to be those who have attained Asmita, Samadhi mentioned in I. 17. Ramnanda Sarasvati considers these individuals to be those who, after the dissolution of their gross bodies, remain in a state of existence devoid of the traditional bodily sheaths. 116 Whether we take Bhava to be ignorance, Sasra, or birth, it should be clear by now that the overall significance remains the same. Bhava points to the world of being or becoming, namely, Prakti. Thus, the Videha, Layas and Prakti, Layas, whether gods or yogis stranded on one of the levels of Samprajanata, Samadhi outlined in the previous sutra, are beings who remain absorbed in one of the above evolutes of Prakti until the activation of their saskras eventually thrusts them back into lower forms of sasra to experience the fruits of their previous activities. Thus, despite difference in detail, 117 the commentators agree that while such yogis may have transcended grosser notions of self, identity, they have not yet realized their true essential nature as Purua but still identify themselves with some other, finer aspect of matter. Therefore, says Bhojaraja, their attainments are to be considered semblances of real yoga. They are as if liberated, says Vyasa, or, as Vaikaspati Misra puts it, they still have their work cut out for them, namely, realization of the actual true self. The point holds, but since the Purua is in fact covered by Buddhi and Ahakra, etc., the Prakti, Laya yogis have nonetheless attained legitimate and insightful realizations of the embodied self that can be attained only by discipline and meditation. Even if they are non-ultimate, their realizations certainly surpass the notions of those who identify themselves with the gross physical body. These two categories of entities, which we can perhaps refer to as imperfect yogis, exist in a state that approximates absolute freedom because they are free from the citta, vittas, fluctuating states of mind, and their minds consist only of saskaras, subconscious impressions or latent propensities. They are thus, from normal perspectives, highly evolved beings, but they are still immersed in some aspect of prakti, and, say Vyasa and Vaikaspati Misra, they have to return to the cycle of birth and death when their latent saskaras start to fructify. One might infer from all this that imperfect yogis have at some point, through introspection, attained the realization over time that they are not the gross body but one of the other layers of prakti. As with any type of devoted and consistent meditation, such prolonged cultivation results in their minds being saturated with saskaras pertaining to this particular insight. These are highly refined saskaras and not productive of citta, vittas. Such yogis remain in their respective states for as long as these accumulated saskaras dominate the citta and other more active saskaras do not surface. Perhaps we can conclude that the videhas and prakti, layas have attained some sort of samprajanata. Samprajanata, samadhi insofar as they have attained a state of complete cessation of thought, with all their saskaras inactive, but their awareness, rather than being absorbed in the source of awareness, purua itself, is still absorbed in some subtle dimension of prakti. In time, then, unlike with ideal yogis absorbed in purua, or self-awareness, these other two types of yogis are eventually pulled back down into the more mundane states of mind when their latent saskaras reactivate. They are once more prone to bhava, becoming, that is, embodied existence. Several commentators quote a verse from the Vajrapura that states that those who identify themselves as beings constituted by the sense organs remain in their particular state for a period corresponding to 10 manas, 118 those identifying themselves with the subtle elements, 100 periods of the same, those with ahakara, ego, 1000 periods, those with buddhi, 10,000, and those with unmanifest. Primordial, pre-evolutionary prakti, a full 100,000. Whatever the details, the point seems to be that one can remain identified with and absorbed in extremely subtle dimensions of prakti for prolonged periods of time, but not eternally. Only realization of the purua by means of the asamprajanata, samadhi is eternal. Otherwise, sooner or later, other saskaras, perhaps connected with grosser objects of thought cultivated in prior lifetimes, begin to activate like frogs, says Vaikaspati Misra, during the rainy season. Such reactivated memories and impressions awaken and impel these yogis back into the cycle of action and reaction, and hence of birth and death, sasra unless, says Vaikaspati Misra, while in their disembodied state, they develop true discrimination of the difference between any aspect of prakti whatsoever and the real self, purua. Vijanabhiku also points out that these yogis need not necessarily return to sasra when their saskaras reactivate, from their ethereal states they can gradually strive further for ultimate liberation. In this case, as the Vajrapura quoted above acknowledges, they are eligible to remain eternally immersed in awareness of purua. 20 Sraddha, Virya, Samti, Samadhi, Prajna, Purvaka Itaram Shraddha, faith, Virya, vigor, Samti, memory, Samadhi, absorption, Prajna, discernment, Purvaka, preceded by, Itaram, for others but for others, the state where only subconscious impressions remain is preceded by faith, vigor, memory, Samadhi absorption, and discernment. Vyasa contrasts the sutra with the previous one by introducing the term upaya, pratyaya, the state where only subconscious impressions remain can be attained by the bhava, pratyaya of the previous sutra, that is, can have prakti as its cause, or by upaya, pratyaya, can have upaya, practice, as its cause. The implication is that the means adopted by real yogis to attain this state are the proper means indicated in the sutra: faith, vigor, memory, samadhi absorption, and discernment. If these means are adopted, the practitioner will not return to prakti like the bhava, pratyaya beings of the last sutra. The commentators take the sutra as promoting a progression of events that must be undertaken by the aspiring yogi. Vyasa takes shraddha, faith, to be clarity of mind, which perhaps indicates that since any type of enterprise requires faith that it will lead to the attainment of a goal, when one sees things clearly, one can understand which kind of endeavor best merits one's trust. Vaikaspati Misra states that faith is belief in the goal of the enterprise, which in this case is asamprajanata. Samadhi. Vyasa states that faith sustains like a benevolent mother, it supports the yogi until the very end. Deep faith gives rise to the second item on Patanjali's list, virya, vigor, or energetic endeavor, which the commentators take to be the pursuit of the 8 limbs of yoga that will be described in some detail in chapter 2. Faith, then, inspires energetic action in pursuing the practices of yoga. We can note that according to 2:38, the attainment of virya, vigor, is specifically achieved by the practice of celibacy, an indispensable ingredient in the 8 limbs of yoga. This virya, in turn, produces the next item, samti, memory, which is taken by Vyasa to mean an undisturbed mind, by Vaikaspati Misra to indicate always keeping the goal in mind, and by Akara to refer to scriptural knowledge. This focused state of mind passes into the penultimate stage mentioned in the sutra, samprajanata, samadhi, or undeviated concentration on an object, which Patanjali addressed in I-17. As a result of the complete absence of distraction in samadhi, the final item on the list, prajna, discernment, the ability to see things as they really are, manifests. The ultimate act of discrimination is the ability to distinguish purua from any aspect of prakti. The mind, says Vyasa, has now accomplished its goal and fulfilled the purpose of its existence and thus need no longer continue to operate. Consequently, preceded by the 5 stages indicated in the sutra, asamprajanata, samadhi, the complete uncoupling of the purua from the mind now ensues. As scholars have long noted, these 5 stages find a parallel in the Buddha's pre-enlightenment training under his 2 yogi teachers, Rakalama and Adaka son of Rama, 119, which, while understood differently between the traditions, underscores once again the shared context of meditational practices in ancient India. I-21 Tifra, Savdam Sunna Tifra, Keen, Savdam, for those with intensity, Sunna, near, proximate. This state of samprajanata is near for those who apply themselves intensely. Patanjali indicates here that the speed at which the goal of yoga is attained depends on one's degree of commitment. Although Patanjali mentions only intensity, the commentators, following Vyasa, infer that there are 3 degrees of application implied in the sutra, gentle and moderate as well as intense tifra. Categorizations and subcategorizations are ubiquitous in Indic knowledge systems. 120 Indeed, the next sutra indicates that each of the 3 levels mentioned here is subdivided into 3 more levels of intensity, resulting in 9 different levels of commitment, or degrees of application to the process of yoga. These lead to the ultimate goal of yoga with different degrees of rapidity. Otherwise, says Vaikaspati Misra, success would accrue to all without distinction, which is not the case. Success is noticed in some yogis but not in others. Vaikaspati Misra considers these differences to be due to the strength, or weakness, of ingrained habits from previous lives. In other words, disruptive saskras from past births exerting their influence on the various yogis in this life, and these may interfere with their practices. In short, this sutra states that the attainment of samadhi and its fruit are near, sunna, for those most intensely committed. I-22 do, madhyat hi matrat vat tato pi via do, mild, madhya, middling. And hi matrat vat, because of intensity, tata, from this, consequently, api, also, via, distinction. Even among these, there is further differentiation of this intensity into degrees of mild, mediocre, and extreme. As noted above, each of the 3 levels identified by the commentators is subdivided, thus there is mild, do, intensity of application to the requirements of yoga, mediocre, madhya, intensity to these requirements, and extreme, adhimatra, intensity. Likewise, there are the same 3 degrees of mediocre application, intense or above, average mediocrity, middling or average mediocrity, and mild or below, average mediocrity, and the same triad of possibility for mild application. In other words, there is a spectrum of application in yoga practice, and, expectedly, the speed of success depends on the degree of commitment. Akara says the purpose of this sutra is to fortify the enthusiasm of the practitioner. By learning that all yogis, whether slow or swift in their application, eventually attain the goal, practitioners are encouraged, and those who have become despondent due to fatigue from excessive effort regain confidence. But that there are gradations in the attainment of the goal of yoga, he says, is just as in the world, where, in a race, the prize goes to the person who runs the fastest. Chappell, 1994, who considers Patanjali's text to be a concatenation of summaries of yoga texts extant in his day, suggests that Vyasa tends to comment on sutras individually, in isolation, and sometimes misses or neglects groupings or units. Chappell argues that such is the case here. Vyasa has overlooked the possibility that Patanjali intended the sutra to qualify the 3 previous sutras. The word tata, consequently, in this sutra suggests its connection with these preceding sutras. Given that there are 3 qualitative degrees mentioned in the sutra, and the 3 previous sutras can be read as 3 progressively advancing states of attainment, he connects the 3 degrees of application mentioned here with Sutras I. 19 to 22. Thus, the mild of this sutra should be taken as describing those merged in Prakti in I. 19, the mediocre, as referring to those practicing faith, etc. described in Sutra I. 20, and the ardent, as those mentioned in the previous sutra who are near to the goal. I. 23 Isvara, Pradhan Va Isvara, the Lord, prayed, from devotion, dedication, Va, or, this previously mentioned state is attainable from devotion to the Lord. Patanjali here states that the goal of yoga can be attained by the grace of God, Isvara. In this sutra, the theistic element of the sutras is encountered for the first time. The theistic, or Isvaravada, element in Indic thought stretches back at least to the late Vedic period, 121 Isvara, from the root is, to have extraordinary power and sovereignty, is already used 6 times by the Atharva Veda in circa 1000 B.C.E, and refers in the oldest texts to a personal but unnamed God. It is the term preferred in philosophical discourse concerning the existence of a personal God. In partial contrast to the term Bhagwan, 122 Isvara is often concerned more with a philosophical category in these contexts than with specific divine personal supreme beings such as Vayu, Shiva, Enka, who all lay claim to the title Isvara in Puric and epic texts. Of the 6 schools of traditional thought that stem from this period, 5 Nyaya, Vaiyika, 123 Vedanta, Yoga, and Skya were or became theistic. Skya, although often represented as non-theistic, was in fact widely theistic in its early expressions and continued to retain widespread theistic variants outside of the classical philosophical school thereafter, as evidenced in the Puras, for example, Bhagavata 3rd Canto. 124 Yoga has always been theistic, as Feuerstein and others have enjoined emphatically. The popular academic notion that the conception of God was interpolated into classical yoga is completely unfounded. 1974, 90. In his commentary, Vyasa asks rhetorically whether there is any other effective way to attain samprajanata, samadhi without delay. As Patanjali indicates in the sutra, devotion to God is such an option. This notion of attaining a vision of the self by the grace of God goes back to the Upanishads, Katha 2. 20, Svetasvatara 3. 20. Reflecting Patanjali's undogmatic and non-sectarian sophistication, Isvara, Pradna, devotion to God, may not be the exclusive or mandatory way to attain realization of the self, given the particle va, or, in this sutra, it is clearly favored by him. One of the earliest references to being granted by a supreme being, the boon, prasada, of perceiving the Purua, Atman, occurs in the Kaha Upaniyad. Greater than the great, smaller than the small, is the Atman situated in the heart of beings. One without desires and free of sorrow sees the majesty of the self by the grace of the Creator. 20. Etymologically, pratna means to place oneself down, prostrate, submit, etc. 125. And while not a common term, means devotional submission, for example, Gita 11:44. Devotion to God, according to Vyasa, involves a particular type of devotion, bhakti, via, simply by the yogi's longing, God bestows his grace upon the yogi. When this happens, the fruits of samadhi become quickly available. As Ramananda Sarasvati puts it, God turns toward the yogi as a result of such devotion and says, "Let this that he desires be his." Vaikaspati Misra considers such special devotion to consist of submission to the Lord with body, mind, and word. Bhojaraja, with an eye on the Jita's desireless action, adds that it entails devoting all one's actions to the Lord, desiring no fruit for oneself. Hariharananda describes this state as feeling the existence of God in the innermost core of the heart and considering everything to be done by the Lord. As one meditates on the Lord in this way, and loses interest in everything else, one becomes free from ego, and the mind becomes concentrated and calm. Akara states that the sutra describes bhakti, the yoga of devotion, where the Lord reaches out to the yogi who is fully devoted to him, indeed, comes face to face with him, and bestows his grace upon him in accordance with how the yogi has meditated upon him. Thus, in line with the yoga tradition's prioritization of experience, one can attain a direct vision of God, by his grace. This grace, through which samadhi and the goals of yoga are attained, is effortless and imparted by the Lord's omnipotence. Along the same lines, Vijanabhiku states that by meditating on the Lord with love, the yogi earns the Lord's favor. He quotes a number of scriptures stating that knowledge of God is the cause of liberation and, indeed, and here Vijanabhiku is reflecting the position of the Bhakti traditions, knowledge of Isvara is more important even than knowledge of the Purua self. Consequently, the path of devotion for Vijanabhiku, and for the overall yoga tradition, is the best means of attaining samprajanata, samadhi, since it does not require one to be solely dependent on one's own steam and resources in the intense application noted in the previous sutras. It seems useful to present a synopsis of the theistic element in the sutras at this point. Isvara occurs in three distinct contexts in the Yoga Sutras. The first, beginning with this sutra, is in the context of how to attain the ultimate goal of yoga, the cessation of all thought, samprajanata, samadhi, and realization of Purua. Patanjali presents dedication to Isvara as one such option, and his discussion of Isvara begins with this sutra, and continues to 28, or perhaps, indirectly, up to 33. It is important to note Va, or, in this sutra, indicating that Patanjali presents devotion to Isvara, the Lord, as an optional rather than an obligatory means of attaining samadhi, although some commentators state that Purua cannot detach itself from Prakti without the grace of Isvara. The only information Patanjali gives concerning the nature of God is provided in the next few sutras. In 24, he states, the Lord is a special soul. He is untouched by the deposits of saskras, 126 fructification of karma, 127 karma, or the obstacles to the practice of yoga, the kleshas of 2. 3. Nescience, ego, attachment, aversion, and the will to live. Sutra 25 informs the reader that in him, the seat of omniscience is unsurpassed, and, in Sutra 26, that he was also the teacher of the ancients, because he is not limited by time. Given the primary context of the sutras, fixing the mind on an object without deviation, Sutras I. 27 to 28 specify how Isvara is to be meditated upon. The name designating him is the mystical syllable O, and its repetition and the contemplation of its meaning should be performed. As a result of this devotional type of meditation comes the realization of the inner consciousness and freedom from all obstacles. The second context in which Patanjali refers to Isvara is in the first sutra in chapter 2, Kriya, Yoga, the path of action, consists of self, discipline, study, and dedication to the Lord. The following two sutras inform us that by performing such Kriya, Yoga, Samadhi is attained and the obstacles to this, the klesas, are weakened. Finally, Isvara surfaces again in a third context in 2:32, where the niyamas are listed. The niyamas, which are the second limb of the eight-limb path of yoga, consist of cleanliness, contentment, austerity, study and, as in the other two contexts, Isvara, Pradna, devotion to Isvara. Thus, the three ingredients of Kriya, Yoga are all niyamas. The various benefits associated with following the yamas and niyamas, ethics and morals, are noted in the ensuing sutras of the chapter, and 2:45 states that the benefit from the niyama of devotion to God is the attainment of samadhi. This is the final reference to Isvara in the text. These, then, are the gleanings that can be extracted from Patanjali's characteristically frugal sutras. From the first context, we learn that the highest samadhi can be attained by dedication to Isvara, a claim Patanjali will repeat in the third section. This suggests that Isvara has the absolute power to manipulate the laws of nature, to circumvent the normal procedures required for practitioners to fix their mind, by removing the obstacles to yoga, and somehow to pluck the devoted yogi from his or her material embeddedness simply by an act of grace. We learn that Isvara is a special Purusha insofar as he has never been touched by karma and saskras and the klesas, in short, by the normative influences and conditions to which all Purushas in the world of sastra are subject. In other words, Isvara has never been subject to sastra. He is an eternal being, since he is untouched by time, and thus he taught the ancients. This indicates that Isvara is concerned with the well-being of the souls in this world and actively involved in their upliftment by promoting knowledge. He makes himself available in the form of the repetition of the sound O, which should be recited, Patanjali seems to imply, in a devotional mood, since its meaning, which should be contemplated, is Isvara the subject of devotional surrender. In the second context in which the term is used, Patanjali briefly alludes to the three ingredients of a practice he terms Kriya, Yoga, which is a more action-based aspect of yoga than the intense meditational regimen outlined in chapter I. Here, devotion to Isvara is mandatory, in contrast to the meditational path, where it is optional, as a means of attaining samadhi. Finally, in the third context in 2:32, Patanjali again lists Isvara, Pradna as a niyama, a mandatory prerequisite for the higher stages of yoga. Moreover, he notes that from this practice, samadhi is attained. Again, this is significant, because all the boons mentioned as accruing from the other yamas and niyamas, there are 10 in all, represent praktik, or material, attainments, vitality, knowledge of past lives, detachment, etc. It is only from Isvara, Pradna, the last item on the list of yamas and niyamas, that the ultimate goal of yoga is achieved, samadhi. Thus we can conclude that Patanjali is definitely promoting a degree of theistic practice in the Yoga Sutras. Although in the first context commencing with the present sutra, Isvara, Pradna, devotional surrender to God, is optional as a means of attaining samadhi, Patanjali does direct 6 sutras to Isvara, which is not insignificant given the frugality of his sutras. This devotional surrender is not optional in the second context, Kriya, Yoga. Since it is likewise not optional in the third context as a niyama, which is a prerequisite to meditational yoga, Patanjali seems to be requiring that all aspiring yogis be devotionally oriented in the preparatory stages to the higher goals of yoga, and although in the higher, more meditational stages of practice they may shift their focus of concentration to other objects, I. 34 to 38, even, ultimately, to any object of their pleasing, I. 39, they would be best advised to retain Isvara as object thereafter, since this special Purua can bestow perfection of samadhi, which other objects cannot. 2. 45. Another way of putting this is that any object can serve as the focus of meditation, but only one object can, in addition to this function, accelerate the attainment of samadhi. Therefore, one would be hard pressed to find a rationale to pick some other object that does not have this ability. Who would not opt for two for the price of one? To my reading, then, Patanjali, while not blatantly demanding that yogis maintain their devotion to Isvara in the higher stages of their meditations, does seem to be discreetly, or perhaps not even so discreetly, promoting it. I envisioned Patanjali as being too sophisticated a thinker and practitioner to be insistent about this dimension of the tradition, and too delicate about the sensitivities of the non-theistic orientations of other yogi practitioners on the horizons of his day to be dogmatically exclusivistic. But he is clearly recommending submission to God as the best and most expedient path. When Ko was asked by Arjuna who is superior, those worshipping him with devotion or those trying to fix their minds on their own self, by their own prowess, Ko replied that the devotee is the best of those engaged in yoga, yuktadhamma, even though those whose minds are fixed on the individual self also attain him. 12. 1-4. The difficulty of those whose minds are attached to the Atman 1-8 is greater than those who fix their minds on Ka in devotion. The path of the impersonal Atman is attained with difficulty by embodied beings. But those who, meditating on Mika, worship me, considering me to be the supreme, and renouncing all actions in me, with undeviating yoga, for those whose thoughts are immersed in me, it is I who quickly become the deliverer from the ocean of death and transmigration. 12. 5-7.